swear before the court, swear testimony about to give to be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so be God.
I do.
Thank you.
All right, you take a seat, sir, make yourself nice and comfortable, and when you are settled and comfortable and directing your statements into that flat microphone in front of you, please state your full name and spell your last name for the record.
Peter Roger Breggin, M.D., B-R-E-G-G-I-N.
Thank you. You may proceed, Mr. Castaldo.
Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Breggin, are you married?
Yeah,
And how long have you been married?
35 years.
Okay. And do you have any children?
I do.
And how many?
I have 4.
And their ages?
Oh, golly. We didn't practice that. 30, 37, 40s, early 50.
And could you please describe your educational background?
I went to Harvard. While I was at Harvard, I spent 4 years working as a volunteer in state mental hospital programs and ended up directing the Harvard-Radcliffe State Mental Hospital Volunteer Program. So I really got an introduction at the age of 18 to clinical work, being on the wards, working with patients. During that time, I had grants from Harvard and from the National Institute of Mental Health to work on the volunteer program. And I also went to classes.
What volunteer programs? What are the volunteer programs that you did while at Harvard?
Well, first we had a large program of 200 people that went onto the wards, visited with the patients, helped clean up the wards, helped keep things calm. And then eventually, I talked to the superintendent, and we got a case aid program where 12 approximately students got to work with individual patients. This was very unusual. It was quite unusual at the time. And we had the supervision of a single social worker, a very wise and gentle person who worked with us, met with us once a week. And at first the goal was basically, would the volunteers do any harm to the patients? But actually we got almost all the patients out of the hospital in the first year, and most of them stayed out of the hospital.
And what year did you graduate Harvard?
58.
And did you further your education after Harvard?
Yes, I went to Case Western Reserve Medical School in Cleveland. During that time, I spent 4 years researching the psychophysiology of anxiety, did animal experimentation on the effects of adrenaline on behavior, and published a couple of papers from my medical school research soon after medical school.
And what year did you receive, is that where you obtained your medical degree?
Yes, since 1962.
And where did you do your residency?
Well, first the internship. I went to the Upstate Medical
So you
Center.
did an internship before the residency?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Whereabouts?
I went to Syracuse, New York, to the New York State Upstate Medical Center. It's a part of the New York State system, because they had the only internship at the time where I could take 6 months of psychiatry, because I knew since I was 18 or 19 that was the direction I was going in. And I stayed there a year. And then I went back to Harvard. I knew all the professors at Harvard from the volunteer program because they were the supervisors of our program. I went there for a year, and I really liked it in upstate New York. I went back to upstate New York for my second 2 years of residency training.
And where did you complete that?
Back at SUNY, at State University of New York in the Upstate Medical Center.
And at some point, did you work with the National Institute of Mental Health?
Yes, I joined the United States Public Health Service. I was a uniformed officer, lieutenant commander, and I was assigned to the National Institute of Mental Health, which was a really very good thing to get. So I went to Washington, D.C. eventually, and first I was out in Virginia, and I did worked on developing community mental health centers for, in particular, North Carolina, but also other states. And then I went to Washington, D.C., where I worked in mental health and education, which has always been an interest of mine, and children. I was particularly about children and teenagers, mental health and education for a year.
And what were you actually doing for the National Institute of Mental Health?
Well, in the first first year, I was actually going out into communities, and I would work in individual communities on how to build and staff mental health centers. I was evaluating state systems as well and writing reports on them. And then in Washington, D.C., I was basically a part of the team that funded new cutting-edge pioneering research in mental health and education. Basically, how to make schools more healthy, how to make them better places for young people to be in.
And speaking of schools, have you held any teaching positions?
Yes, when I finished at the National Institute of Mental Health, I went into private practice, and from then on, I always pretty much had some sort of a teaching position. I taught at the Washington School of Psychiatry in Washington, D.C., and then in the counseling department at the University of Maryland. I taught in an educational school called Antioch Putney, and I taught in the Conflict Resolution Center at George Mason University. That's all while I was in Washington, D.C.
And can you list and describe your professional activities, please?
Well, there are a lot of them. I'll be brief, though. Well, since 1968, I was in full-time practice of psychiatry until 2000, and, well, 15 years ago, we moved to upstate New York because we both loved that area. And since then, I've been seeing patients only 10 to 20 hours a week. But up until then, probably 35 hours a week of seeing patients. So that's always been the basic activity. A second activity has been the teaching. Another activity has been writing books. I've written about 22 or 23 books that deal with psychiatry. Many of them medical books, many of them popular books that are also usable in school.
So what is your specialty? Is it psychiatry?
It's psychiatry.
Do you have a subspecialty?
Yeah, over the years I've developed a subspecialty in clinical psychopharmacology. You know, I began actually doing...
And what is that?
It's the study of the effect of drugs on the actual clinical, real-life behavior of people. So it's clinical in contrast to, say, a research in using animals, or even formal research studies using people. It's looking at it in the clinical setting, what happens in the real lives of people. But I've also done a lot of research pertaining to the scientific side of things. And I did my first book on psychopharmacology in 1983 called Psychiatric Drugs, Hazards to the Brain. And I've written a series of books from that.
We'll get to that in a minute.
Okay.
How many patients have you seen in the course of your clinical practice?
Oh, it's thousands. I mean, I wouldn't know how to count them.
And are you an editorial consultant?
I'm on editorial boards of a number of journals, in particular the relevant here, the International Journal of Risk and Safety in Medicine, which is the...
And what does that cover?
It's the premier journal for looking at risk and safety, potential harms of medical treatments in general, not just psychiatric. And I'm one of the two maybe psychiatric consultants on the board. Others are in epidemiology or medicine.
And what does a psychiatric consultant do on the board?
Partly it's to credential the journal. The journal has to have a certain number of experts in the field to have credibility, to get carried at the National Library of Medicine, to get put in the various registries that there are for scientific journals. So to do that, they have to have a board, and the board has to cover the areas with expertise, and mine has to do with both psychiatry and also the FDA and federal regulation, which I've done a fair amount of work in. Occasionally, they'll send me an article to review, but not very often.
Have you ever been hired as a medical expert or consultant to any governmental bodies?
The Federal Aviation Agency hired me to actually defend them in a lawsuit, to be a consultant to them, where a pilot wanted to fly using the SSRI antidepressants, the class of antidepressants in this suit, and in this criminal case. And so I was a consultant to them and wrote up an evaluation and a scientific analysis of what the problems were if you were going to be a pilot flying and taking SSRIs.
Okay, and just so we know, an SSRI is what?
Selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. It's a class of drugs that began with Prozac, and which went onto the market in early 1989, as I recall. It was approved in late '88. And the theory behind it is that there might be insufficient activity of a neurotransmitter system, a chemical messenger in the brain called serotonin. And if something could be done to make more serotonin available, in this case by removing its uptake, stopping its uptake.
If I may, we'll get into that in a couple of minutes. Have you given any presentations in front of any governmental bodies?
A great many, especially when I was in D.C. and they could call me and ask me to come with ease.
And can you please give us an overview of such presentations?
Well, a couple at the National Institute of Mental Health were just invited presentations. National Institute of Neurological Diseases and Stroke, and several others, Education Department.
Have you ever
Variety.
have you ever spoken in front of any governmental agencies or Congress?
Yeah, let me, to elaborate a bit on the
You
presentation.
need not elaborate, doctor. You may answer the question.
Okay. Yes, sir.
Can you please describe your presentations in front of those?
I've been invited going back to the early 70s to address Congress. In that case, it was about children. It was the Education Committee, I believe, and to talk about children and medication and better ways to help children with school issues like ADHD, attention deficit disorder, hyperactivity disorder, to better ways to help than medicating, alternative approaches, better approaches. I was invited by Ted Kennedy to present at a hearing on psychosurgery, because I had been publicly very critical and scientifically.
What is psychosurgery?
Lobotomy.
Okay.
Lobotomy was coming back at that time, and I was opposing its coming back.
And a lobotomy is what?
That's surgical interventions into the brain where you destroy brain tissue for psychiatric purposes.
Okay. And how about the Veterans Affairs?
Yeah, 2010, I was the actual main presenter around which the hearings were built for the Congressional Committee on Veterans Affairs.
And what was the topic?
The topic was psychiatric drugs in the military. What were the problems with that? Particularly violent and suicidal behavior, but also other behaviors.
And have you ever given any presentations in front of any hospitals or universities?
Yeah, I've spoken to hospitals and universities throughout the United States, Canada, Great Britain, Sweden, Denmark, various places. Most recently, I was Skyping to Norway and to Denmark, excuse me, and to London, to a big conference in Mexico City.
Have you been invited to give any speeches in front of various federal agencies?
Yes, I've covered some of them, but there are two that are very important where I was invited to be the scientific expert at two consensus development conferences. Consensus development conferences they're a big deal. They're very heavily covered by the press. They're considered to be very important. And an attempt is made to reach a consensus on a controversy around a treatment.
And what were the subjects of those that you attended?
One was about electroshock treatment, which I had been critical of, and I was asked to be the expert on brain dysfunction and injury. Actually, neuropathology is what they called it, of the brain as a result of electroshock treatment. And the way it's set up, there's a whole panel of experts, the scientists, who present their viewpoints, and then there's another group in the audience that's a consensus panel, and they make a consensus and publish a consensus out of the presentation for the scientists, by the scientists. The second one is more relevant to here, was the Consensus Development Conference on Attention Deficit Disorder and its treatment. And these are put on by the National Institute of Health and the National Institute of Mental Health together, put on these conferences related to psychiatric treatments. And the director's office asked me to present at the conference on the hazards, side effects, adverse effects of medications for children. So it's very specific to the issues in this case.
Have you spoken before the FDA?
Yes. Now, those are not invited. All the things I've been describing are invited. For the FDA, you just go and you present at a public hearing. It's a right of the public.
FDA is what?
The Food and Drug Administration.
Okay. And what have you spoken before the FDA on? What subjects?
A number of different subjects. The adverse effects of antipsychotic drugs, the adverse effects of stimulant drugs, the adverse effects of the SSRIs. I played a fairly considerable role in the conferences that were developing the changes that we'll be talking about in the FDA information that's given out about the drugs.
Have you received any education and training in the approval process of the FDA?
Yes.
And can you please describe that?
It came out of 1994 when I was asked to be the single expert to do the review of the science for all of the lawsuits against Eli Lilly about Prozac. So there are like 150 or more lawsuits against Lilly for violent suicide and other alleged harms from Prozac. And they had so many different lawyers and so many different cases that the lawyers held a selection process for who would be the one scientist to look at all the records, to interview the FDA, look at the entire FDA process. And a federal judge in Indiana, which is where Lilly is, approved me to do that work. No one had actually ever looked inside the drug company before.
So what did you actually do?
Well, first of all, I interviewed people at the FDA. I went to school on my own about FDA processes and read everything I could find. I attended, I don't know, maybe a dozen conferences, many of them aimed at the executives of drug companies on how to do an application to the FDA. And one of them put on by the FDA about adverse drug effects and what does it mean when the FDA approves a drug? Does it mean it's safe? Does it mean it's effective? And in that conference said basically, well, no, it's just the beginning of the process. You find out most about safety over the years when you're using the drug. So it was just and I also presented at that point. I was learning enough. I was presenting at conferences for attorneys and for professionals involved in these kinds of lawsuits and involved in FDA processes.
And you were presenting, what was the subject matter of those presentations?
It would be the interaction between FDA approval and particular drugs. One in particular that Lexis put on, I think that's the way to say it, Lexis put on, was about children and ADHD, and I talked about that, the approval process, what it really meant, what the advantages and disadvantages of medicating were.
Have you participated in any presentations about the approval process, other than what you've described?
Yeah, I talk about that a lot. Almost any presentation I give that's about medications, which is probably 90% of my presentations, I will deal with some aspect of the FDA process. I'm writing about it all the time. I just wrote a blog about the FDA processes a few weeks ago, and I've written about it in my articles and in my books. So I'm writing about it, talking about it, lecturing about it quite frequently.
And does this include the labelings that eventually are put on the drugs?
Yeah, the label, which is the legal term in the regulations, in the federal regulations, label is the legal term for what people think of as the package insert, that big strip with thousands of words in tiny print. It's also called the full prescribing information. And very often it's published in a privately published book called the Physician's Desk Reference. So people think of it as what's in the Physician's Desk Reference because it's identical. So it's a very important document that's created by the FDA along with the drug companies.
And have you testified before the FDA Psychopharmacology Board?
Yes, those are the talks I mentioned earlier, where I talked about antipsychotic drugs, I talked about the SSRIs. And at the SSRI hearings, the administrator of the SSRI hearings, which were about what are we going to change in the label, the administrator gave every member of the Psychopharmacology Committee, it's called the PDAC, gave them a paper I had written that year.
And what was the subject matter of the paper?
The subject of the matter was suicide, violence, and mania caused by the SSRIs. And a considerable focus from the paper was included in the label, the final label changes for the drug.
And moving along, Doctor, do you have any particular memberships?
I used to have a lot. I thought I was going to cut back when I moved to Ithaca from Washington, D.C. 15 years ago. Up until then, I belonged to a lot of associations. Now, I belong to the American Psychiatric Association, the Canadian Psychiatric Association, and I think it's called the International Association of Medical Editors, or something like that, editors of journals.
And do you have any medical licenses?
I have an active license in New York State where I practice, and I have 3 licenses from when I practiced in Washington, D.C. I have D.C., Virginia, and Maryland, but they're inactive licenses.
Doctor, have you authored any books?
Yes.
And would you please describe them?
I've authored about 23 professional books. The first one was a book about the dangers of shock treatment, actually.
Dangers of what, sir?
Shock treatment.
Okay, thank you.
Now published by Springer Publishing Company in 1979. And then in 1983, I wrote a medical book again from Springer called Psychiatric Drugs, Hazards to the Brain. It was about, what happens to the brain when you put substances into the brain that change its operations. I've written up to about 23 or 24 books now. Most of them deal largely with psychiatric drugs. A couple of them are co-authored and deal with therapy, therapeutic approaches that are drug-free. And some of them deal with therapy. One is about guilt, shame, and anxiety and what it is and how to overcome it. And it looks at
guilt, shame, and anxiety?
Yeah.
And what subject matters are covered in that book?
That book looks at, first it looks at human evolution. Why did we evolve to have guilt, shame, and anxiety? No one had ever really looked at that carefully, surprisingly. So it looks at the whole way we evolved, the family systems we evolved in, how long it took. why we may have needed guilt, shame, and anxiety to control our impulses and our behavior. And it goes on then to talk about, now that we have a more civilized concept of behavior, how we can begin to use reason and love increasingly rather than these built-in evolutionary reflexes, which are rather hit or miss. And a part of it is looking at what amplifies guilt, shame, and anxiety in people, and the underlying helplessness, which is a big theme in the book, that there's an underlying helplessness that's always produced by guilt, shame, and anxiety. It inhibits behavior. And what reinforces that? And I have two rather in-depth chapters about domestic abuse and child abuse, and abusive relationships in general, because they reinforce guilt, shame, and anxiety, and disability and helplessness.
And have you authored any peer review publications?
Yes. May I get a drink of water? Thank you so much.
Before you resume your testimony, Doctor, pull the mic a little bit closer to yourself. Thank you very much.
Now, Doctor, have you authored any peer review publications?
Yes, I
First,
forget.
tell us what a peer review publication is.
It's a publication in a peer-reviewed journal. A peer-reviewed journal is a journal which sends out its articles that are sent to it for independent review by people who are peers, that is, who are supposed to be knowledgeable in the field that the article is in. So that I might get an article on adverse drug effects to review, or I might get one on psychology, guilt, shame, and anxiety to review. They go to the people who have done some work in the field. And when it's set up optimally, it's double-blind. The author is being reviewed by people who don't know the name of the author. So an attempt is made to take out of the article anything that's going to tell people reading it who wrote it, so that they're not biased for or against. Also, the reviews, which may be sent back to the author to make changes, the reviewers are not known to the author. So the reviewers don't have to be afraid of the author's reactions. And so that's the double bind, and that's the peer review.
And can you list your peer review publications?
Yes. And it's not a perfect process, but yes, I do. And there's over 50 of them. They go back to my two interests. The three earliest articles, two were on psychophysiology, the effect of adrenaline on the brain and behavior of animals and humans. I extrapolated to humans from clinical experience and from scientific articles. And the other was on the effects of coercion on patients in hospitals. And it was probably the first article ever written about that. The actual, what does a patient experience when they go into a hospital and then find out, for example, they can't leave without going through a process. They think they're voluntary going in, but then, especially way back then in the 70s, the 60s, patients certainly didn't know that involuntary didn't mean you can leave when you chose to. And I looked at the implications of that and the various kinds of things that happened to people that made it hard to do decent treatment to help people when they were under these conditions.
And did you cover other subject matters in these peer review publications?
Many of them are review articles. One of the things I specialize in is taking a subject like benzodiazepines, that is, drugs like Ativan and Valium was one of the early ones, and Klonopin and Xanax, and doing an overview in particular of what do we have to look out for as adverse effects. And I might review 100 other articles or 60 other articles because they're big review articles. I did one on the SSRIs that I mentioned to you that was given to the committee, the PDAC, the FDA independent committee. I did one when I got ready to do my testimony before Congress on SSRIs and antidepressants. Just to help myself along and to be right on top of it, I did a big review article. I think it had 80 citations to other people and maybe 6 or 7 to myself. Did a big review article on children and ADHD. Some articles, though, where I'm talking about a concept that I'm developing, I may just refer to 6 of my own articles. So it just depends on the kind of article I'm writing, what the form is going to be, and how many references I make to other people. But when I refer to myself, remember, I'm also referring to articles that have 50 or 75 references to other people.
Have you published any of your cases in peer-reviewed journals?
Yes, I have.
And please describe that.
I wrote an article on how psychiatric drugs tend to hide their effects from people, so that a person who is undergoing adverse mental effects almost never, often doesn't attribute it to the drug. For example, it's similar to a person who's getting high, intoxicated, or impaired on alcohol. They will come home and they may do things they never would ordinarily do if they weren't drinking. They might hit their wife or yell at the dog or do something stupid, will make a fool of themselves. But they don't think it's the alcohol. They think the dog is an annoyance. They think their husband or wife is mistreating them. They don't stop and say, you're drunk. Some people do, and those people are safer to be around.
And you've written on that subject?
Yeah, and I call it, gave it the informal name of medication spellbinding, the formal name intoxication, anosognosia, not knowing you're intoxicated. And that was a new concept. When I do something like that, I'm going to probably mostly cite my own evolving thinking on that subject.
What is a book chapter?
Periodically, I get invited to write book chapters for compendium of various kinds on various subjects. It's kind of an honorific thing that somebody thinks that you should be contributing to their work.
Objection, Your Honor. I believe the question was, what is it?
Sustained. Again, doctor, please confine yourself to the question as asked.
And in what areas have you authored book chapters?
A number about therapy, how to do therapy without medication. How do you handle emergencies without medication? A number about the harms from medication. The most recent one is just this year, and it was a book that brought together many of the people in the field who have been describing in more detail the harms from the psychiatric drugs.
Did you interview these people for the book chapter?
No, we didn't interview each other.
Okay.
No, but maybe 12 people who are writing chapters for the book. And it came out of a medical publisher.
And as a result of these book chapters, you also review their articles that they write, the chapters they write?
Well, in this case, yes, I not only reviewed their chapters.
Objection. He answered the question, Your Honor.
Sustained. Wait for another question, please.
Have you received any honors or awards?
Yes, I have over the years,
Okay.
dozen or so.
And from what organizations? Just an overview, if you could list a couple.
Well, the most recent one was in some ways the most pleasing one to me.
Objection,
It
Your
was,
Honor.
I'm sorry, I'm not supposed to.
Overruled, you can have that.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Okay, sorry. there's an organization in Mexico that supports children with extremely high IQs, gifted children. And it's very concerned that many of these children get put on psychiatric drugs. And
What award did you receive from them?
they gave me a silver medal from this this big organization for my compassion, I think, and contributions to the well-being of the world's children. I forget what they call it, world's gifted children. They have a different word for it.
And have you testified in courts before?
Many times, yes, sir.
Okay, and how many times would you estimate?
Well, I keep records since 1985, and I think it's getting up around 90 times in those 15, those 30-plus years.
And what are the subject matters that you have testified on?
The great majority of times, it's about injury from psychiatric drugs. Some were injury from electroshock. Some even from lobotomy, surgical interventions in the brain that damaged brain tissue. Some have related to involuntary treatment. Some have been related to parents who don't want to medicate their children and they're in conflict in the family about it.
Are these criminal, civil?
There are three kinds of cases. One are criminal cases, and they're almost always about a harm, because that's what I've been working on since I was very young, harm from a treatment. So a person, for example, was shot at a policeman who came to his house, but he'd had electroshock treatment that morning, and he was in a dazed and confused state.
So they're both criminal, civil, and you said a third?
And the third is product liability, where a suit is brought against a drug company alleging that it didn't perform properly in the development of the drug, or usually the development of the drug or the promotion of the drug, or both.
And other than in this case, when were you last qualified as an expert in court?
When was I?
Yes.
I was in federal court in Pennsylvania, I believe, the Federal Court of Middle Pennsylvania, and that was a malpractice suit.
And when was that?
I think it's about a year now. Gets blurry.
And have you testified an expert in courts dealing with SSRIs?
A great many times, yes.
Okay. And how many times would you estimate?
I think I did a count of the last 10 years or something, and it was 12 times or something like that. It's like a great portion in recent years.
And at some point in connection with this case, you were engaged?
Yes.
Okay. And let me ask you first, what is an SSRI?
As I mentioned earlier, it's a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. There's a, excuse me, there's a mechanism whereby a cell that produces serotonin.
And what is serotonin?
It's a neurotransmitter that originates, the cells that produce it originate deep in the brain. It's an older transmitter system, evolutionary-wise, that plays a very significant role even in the development in utero of the infant. And so it starts lower in the brain, toward the base of, in the base of the brain, and it extends throughout the brain. So every portion of the
May I
brain.
ask him to use the chalkboard, the whiteboard?
Pardon me?
May I ask the whiteboard
Yeah,
to be
of course.
utilized?
Maybe we can pull that down a little bit, so people can see it a little bit more easily. Actually, why don't we just move it like right behind the witness stand here, that perhaps would be the best. All right, thank you, sir. All right, and turn it a little bit, that's good, okay, thank you. Everyone can see that? You good? All right,
Yes, thank you, Your Honor.
all right.
And
Go ahead.
doctor, looking at that whiteboard, can you, I'm sorry.
Go right to the board, sir.
Okay.
In explaining what an SSRI is and how it works, can you draw on the board to explain?
Yeah, let me try to draw the side of the head with the brain in it. Okay. Now the brain fills this whole space up. And it starts back here with the cerebellum, all the way around, like that. Very roughly. And this is the frontal lobe. It's very important for the understanding of all drug effects on the brain. And it roughly goes back here. It's big. It's what fills your forehead. It's what differentiates, say, between a flat head of an ape or chimp or dog. They don't have this large flowering of the front of the brain. It's the, in a way, it's the seat of all higher human functioning, civilization. When it's injured, everything we think of as human can be injured, most human. And when people try to explain the frontal lobes, it's very interesting because they try to explain their idea of what's human. So they might say executive functioning, they might say reason, they might say future planning, they might say love, they might say creativity, because however you start thinking about what is a human being, you get into front lobes and vice versa. Now, one of the things that it does that's so important is impulse control. So a person who is damaged in the frontal lobe might get very irritable, very angry. You can see this in some dementia patients. Not all, but some dementia patients have been sweet most of their lives, and then they become angry and irritable and difficult. So impulse control. Judgment. So somebody who has been, had very good judgment, wouldn't do anything outlandish, anything dangerous, anything that was just anything reckless, might, when their frontal lobe is injured in some way. And it actually, the injury would not have to necessarily even be a drug. It could be lobotomy produced all this, where you went in and did surgical harm to areas of the frontal lobe. So judgment is impaired. Future consequences will be impaired. Looking ahead, that's pretty subtle. You know, if I do this to a person, it's going to have these negative results. If somebody does this to me, it's going to have negative results. So future consequences are...
And those things are controlled by the frontal lobe?
Largely. It's a very integrated system. Because we're going to see in a minute that serotonin...
Never mind what we're going to see in a minute. Answer the question.
Yes. So future consequences, just wisdom, understanding is impaired, and love and empathy is one of the very first things to be impaired. That's a very subtle aspect of human evolution, our capacity to love and to put ourselves in the shoes of others. There's no other creature that does that the way we do. Love and empathy, any harm there, and the person is no longer so able to kind of see what in the world a viewpoint is.
And how do the SSRIs come into play with the human brain?
Now we're going here, spinal cord. Low down in the brain is a group of nuclei out of which the serotonin producing cells originate. And if you remember back in high school biology, you have a nerve cell. It has a long axon or a short axon. These are pretty long ones. The axon could be infinitesimally small, or it could go down the spinal cord, which make it quite long. And so here's your axon. And here's your body. And then there's another cell. And it's the same general configuration. And I'm going to come back to that in a minute, and I'll go on now to what happens. So these cells project everywhere. You even go into the cerebellum. And on the way, they go to a nuclei called the basal ganglia, from which other cells, called dopaminergic cells, go to the frontal lobes. So it's affecting there. And it, too, is going up into the frontal lobes. It's just going throughout the brain. Now, the theory behind this serotonin, this is a synapse. The synapse is the active space between cells. Now, we're talking about something infinitely complex. There might be 10,000 cells in the synapse, putting things into the synapse or taking things out of the synapse. And one cell might produce many different neurotransmitters. So this is a hugely complicated thing that the drug is interfering with. Hugely, way beyond our even imagination, actually, to get. It's that complicated. But here's the simple concept. And the simple concept was that serotonergic cells, they're putting out serotonin packets.
And what is a serotonin
Well,
packet?
they're putting out serotonin.
Okay.
They're putting out serotonin. The nerve, this nerve, has receptors for the serotonin. So I'm going to just put one in, but we're talking about huge numbers.
And what is serotonin?
It's going to, it stimulates, it fires a nerve that can receive it. So when you get enough of these serotonin, get into the catcher's mitt here, this receptor, say, I'm the cell, and that's my hand, and I'm receiving serotonin. Enough gets in there, the cell fires, and the process goes on. So you can have quite a buildup in there. Well, the idea was, this is not, well, this was just the idea. The idea was that maybe there's not enough in here. The brain isn't doing its job.
Not enough what?
Serotonin. So when people were depressed or angry, maybe there's just not enough serotonin. So they developed a drug, Prozac, and all the SSRIs, that would block the removal of serotonin, the reuptake. So it's a selective serotonin reuptake blocker. And the way it blocks, and this is chemical, the way it blocks is the serotonin gets on here. I'm sorry, the Prozac or the Celexa or the Lexapro gets on here, blocks the removal of the S's, so over time you get more S's. And this is going to be the process that produces the symptoms of the drug, which we'll talk about later. this is very unstable because the brain reacts to this as a toxic intrusion.
And how does it do so?
It tries to stop the effect. It's creating an abnormality. So the brain tries to stop the effect. And in the first, after the first dose even, it stops producing serotonin. So this cell over here, it says, I'm sensing a flooding of this area. I'm not going to put any more back in. That's the chemical reaction. The second thing it does, and that's later on, is it says, I'm getting clogged on my reuptake. I mean, my reuptake isn't working. I'll make it stronger. So this hypertrophies. It goes into an abnormal state of exercising itself to try to get those serotonin out of there despite the blockage. And the third, which is more insidious, takes place over months, and many animal studies show it doesn't necessarily reverse, is that these receptors stop working. They say, too much serotonin, I'm stopping working. So they go minus. And this is studied by looking at rat brains. And the overall effect isn't even the production of more serotonin. It's an irregular redistribution of the serotonin as the drug tries to increase the serotonin by stopping it, by blocking its removal, and the brain is trying to do these other three things, which is to stop producing it, to increase removal processes here, and 3, to cut back receptors.
And what role does serotonin play in the human brain?
The human brain and body. Serotonin is not only in the brain, it's in the gut, it's in the bloodstream, it's a very old, widespread neurotransmitter. And we basically, except for the abnormalities that are produced when we disrupt it, it's very hard to say serotonin is doing this, and another substance is doing that, because the brain, the serotonin is going everywhere. So what we know is that it's a major integrating function. Now the theory is that it has a lot to do with emotional states, but so does the entire brain, and especially the frontal lobes and areas around it that control emotion. It's called the limbic system. So, and then even here on the temporal lobe, you've got areas that control emotion. So
If you can,
it seems, though, to relate somewhat, at least, to emotional states and violence and anger.
and can you describe the adolescent brain versus a full-grown adult's brain?
The most characteristic growth arc of the young brain is that the frontal lobes are...
Objection, Your Honor. If I could be heard on this, please.
Yes.
Your Honor, I respectfully suggest there's been no offer that, and I've read your ruling that this witness was qualified as an expert to talk about the juvenile brain versus the adult brain. I don't remember there being testimony at the voir dire, and I've read Your Honor's ruling.
Aldo,
Well,
on that issue?
I do think we covered this in the voir dire hearing about the growth of the human brain, that the juvenile brain is not fully grown and the frontal lobe is not fully grown.
I will allow Dr. Breggin to testify with respect to the distinction biologically between an adolescent brain and an adult brain, and how that distinction may impact the use of the SSRIs. Beyond that, he will be restricted.
Thank you, Your Honor.
So, Doctor, given the court's ruling, can you explain the difference between the adolescent brain and the adult brain and the effects of the SSRI?
Oh, let's break that down into two questions, please, Mr. Cataldo.
Okay.
All right? The first one is, biologically, what is the distinction between an adult frontal lobe, basically, or brain, and an adolescent, just in terms of the biological aspects?
The brain of the adolescent and up until the early 20s is not fully formed, so it's growing. The brain is actually continuing to grow. Growth means size, and growth in particular, most important, means many more connections that are being made through experience and through growth. As a part of that, the adolescent brain has more difficulty with all of these. Impulse control, judgment, future consequences, love and empathy, the whole works.
Objection, Your Honor.
Sustained, that answer is stricken.
And how does the SSRIs play a role in the juvenile brain versus the adult brain? How is it impacted differently?
The young brain is simply more susceptible to harm
From the SSRI.
from the SSRIs and indeed from pretty much all intrusions that are pharmacologic. It's one of the reasons
And
why
can you
we-
explain that?
That's your answer, that's good.
And can you explain why?
Why that is?
Yes.
Well, first there's the physicality of the brain. It simply doesn't have the strength, the connectivity, the firmness to hold its own, in effect, when huge changes are being inflicted upon it. It doesn't have as good a compensatory mechanisms, and it just isn't as strong and as well developed. As a part of that, and this is a part of the development of the brain, the adolescent lacks experience, and experience is embedded into the brain, or not. So the adolescent lacks the experience of dealing with psychoactive substances that adults get, and the child lacks the experience of maintaining a sense of self and identity, which includes self-control and the other aspects of frontal
And
lobe
how
function.
how do SSRIs play a role in that?
They disrupt the frontal lobe function, and they're going to do more so with children and adolescents and young people up to 23 or 4 than they're going to do in older people. They're going to cause more toxicity, more harm.
And that's because why?
Well, it's all the things I've been saying, and it's reflected in the behavior of adolescents, which
Objection, Your Honor.
All right. The point has been made, Mr. Cataldo,
I'll move on, Your Honor.
that, all right, go ahead. May the doctor resume?
Yeah, please sit down.
Please sit down, Doctor.
thank you.
Doctor, what is the role that the FDA plays with these SSRIs?
The FDA must approve any drug that goes on the market that has any important risks associated with it, or any claims, significant claims associated with it. And that's a very extensive process.
And can you explain that process?
Yes. May I hate to bother you, no, I'm really dry from. The process begins with the drug.
Wait a minute.
Oh, so, excuse me, Your Honor.
All right, go ahead.
And what is the role of the FDA?
It monitors, controls, approves or disapproves the entire approval process.
Can
So
you
that
explain that process?
it begins with a drug company deciding that it has a drug that perhaps it can market. In this case, serotonin was being researched, and they thought that they could market a drug that changed serotonin activity. So they then have to make an initial investigative plan that they submit to the FDA, called the IND. And in that plan, they describe what they're going to do, how they're going to, do the study of the background of these drugs, how they're going to do animal research on these drugs, and how they're going to do some initial volunteer studies, very small.
Are there different phases?
Yes, this is phase one,
Okay.
yeah.
And,
Now, I haven't finished.
okay, my apologies. Can you continue with the process of the FDA?
The FDA then has to approve this new drug application. If it does, then the drug company can go ahead. But there's a huge amount of communication going on between the drug company and the FDA about how it's doing it, the way it should do it. It's basically a negotiation from beginning to end. It's a negotiated process, with the FDA setting all the rules, and those rules are incorporated into statutes, into regulations, into the CFR, the basic federal regulations. If it gets approved, it then goes on to do some of the human volunteer studies.
Is this a different phase, or
We're now going toward phase two.
Okay.
We're in phase two. If the humans do not, develop some terrible reactions, it's not about treating a disorder. The
Objection, Your Honor. As to,
I'm sorry, could I have the last answer again? Could you state that last sentence?
I think I said if the humans don't develop some terrible reactions.
and then
If humans don't develop, what kind of...
Terrible, serious, bad.
What's your question?
there was another, that wasn't his last statement. Your
All
Honor.
right, okay, put the question again, we'll start from the beginning.
Okay, all right. Explain phase two, what happens, how it goes from phase one, what causes it to be allowed to go to phase two?
Well, the approval of the FDA.
Okay.
And in phase two, we're working not with people who have a mental illness, but volunteers who are thought to be normal, in order to see what's gonna happen when we give these drugs to people. We've given it to animals. We know there's other drugs similar, maybe. And now we're gonna try it on a relatively small number of
And
humans.
that is phase two.
Phase two, and if,
And what happens in phase two?
basically, you're looking to see if this drug has some unexpected neurotoxic effects that are beyond safety measures, basically. Can we go ahead with it? Then, well, that's actually back in phase one. That's back in your IND. In phase two, you then go to the studies of people with disorders. But you're not doing, and more this is being skipped, you're not doing the full intensive, what will be called the placebo-controlled clinical trials. You're doing preliminary trials. And then in phase three, you go to doing these trials that are written up in the label or full prescribing information for the drug. The FDA requires only 2 trials to show effectiveness statistically based on the testing that's done. Usually, many more are done in order to get 2 that are proven effective, And all of the studies are used to look at adverse effects. So adverse effects will be put together in a huge bundle that includes phases 1, 2, and 3, and any other studies that were done in any other way by the company, any reports they're getting from their researchers on adverse effects. So the adverse effects is looked at in the clinical trials themselves, and then in very broadly what's been reported.
And what happens after phase 3?
Well, then the drug gets approved or it doesn't. And during that process, there's this very extensive negotiation about what's going to go in the label.
And are you familiar with that process?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. And how are you familiar with that process?
Well, I studied it extensively when I talked about when I was chosen to be the one scientist looking at all the Prozac science. So I studied it extensively, read a lot, interviewed people about it. But since then, I've been involved in numerous product liability suits where I get to go inside the company. A judge empowers me to go into the company and look at what is considered proprietary or private information. So I get to look at everything. They're supposed to produce pretty much everything about the whole development of the drug, all the memos between everybody and all the protocols or plans. So I get to look at all of that in a number of different cases.
And are you familiar with the label for Celexa?
Yes.
And how about Prozac?
Yes.
And Lexapro?
Yeah.
And citalopram?
Yes. Celexa is citalopram and Lexapro is S-citalopram. ES citalopram.
One and the same, in other words? Or can you describe what you mean by that?
When Celexa was developed, they could not get it approved for children. And this was a problem for the drug company. Obviously, they wanted to do the children's market.
So the record is clear, Doctor, I hate to interrupt you, but when you use the term children, in terms of the FDA regulations, how is that term defined?
Under 18.
Under 18. Thank you, sir. I'm sorry to interrupt you.
So the drug company decided to tweak the chemical, tweak the molecule of citalopram. And these chemicals come in mirror images, like faces looking at each other. There's a mixture of them. And often, one of the mirror images has more effect. So in part to apply for getting it approved for children, and also to extend their trademark longer, they made a combination in which they extracted the right-handed mirror image and simply put in, almost entirely, as much as they could, the left-handed image. And this proved to have more impact, and for that reason, the dose of S-citalopram is smaller than the dose of citalopram because it has more punch in it. And it's about half, as you might expect. It's about half.
Is the label for these treated as a class or is it individualized?
There is a large part of the label that is called a class label, which was developed and enlarged during some of these hearings that I was talking about. When they held the hearings, it was about enlarging the label and addressing a number of adverse effects that had come up in regard to all the SSRIs. So while they have some distinguishing features, Paxil has a much longer half-life than the other SSRIs. Celexa has a particular effect on, for some reason, getting people to eat carbohydrates, which is relevant to this case. But the harms done, the warnings, and precautions and adverse effects were found to be quite similar. So they developed a black box warning, which is the highest level, that is and remains a class warning for all of these drugs, later expanded to all the antidepressants, but that's not what the studies were from the SSRIs mostly, and a couple of other drugs. So they have a class label for all these drugs that has a black box warning, that then has a very extensive section on warnings, and then precautions and warnings mixed together.
And can you describe the differences between black box warnings and precautions that you're speaking of?
It's the level of intensity of risk, and it's also the level of causation required to put it in. Now, all three levels, the black box, the warnings and precautions, and even the adverse events that are reported, require some causation. The highest degree of causation is in the black box and the warnings.
And do you know whether or not the SSRI's Celexa has a black box warning?
Yes,
And how about citalopram?
but that's the same. Citalopram is the chemical name for Celexa.
And Lexapro?
Lexapro, yes,
Okay, a black box warning.
yes. And Paxil.
And you are familiar with these black box warnings?
Yes.
Okay. And first with Celexa, what are the effects and the warnings of Celexa?
Let me just get it in case I need some, well, I don't even know where it is. I'll go from memory at this point. The black box warning specifically says that there's an increased risk of suicide in people age 24 and younger. It describes the studies from which this was determined, and it has a section in it in which it talks about the importance of monitoring people for these adverse effects.
Is there anything other than an increased risk of suicide?
It focuses on that, but let me see if I may take a minute and just grab it to refresh. Do you have it there? I don't see
20
it.
minutes, please, Your Honor.
I have it in front of me. Any of them will do.
You have to go, respect, don't ramble on, because it's all going on the record.
Okay.
May I approach, Your Honor?
Yes, you may.
This is the medication guide. That's mainly what's in the black box warning.
When you say mainly what's in the
Black box warning, it's about
Operating from your
suicide, it's about the,
Operating from your memory, what is on the black box?
no, it talks about the suicide rate, the increase in the suicide behavior. It's actually suicidality, because there are hardly ever actual suicides in clinical trials. The patients are being encouraged and monitored and given hope, and
What is suicidality?
suicidality is thoughts and behaviors that are suicidal. It's not completed suicides in these little studies.
And the next level down from the black box, warnings and precautions?
Yes.
And what do they say?
Well, there's a lot in the warnings and precautions. They start out by describing what is called an activation or stimulant syndrome.
And what is that?
It's basically what I described in my paper as overstimulation from the SSRIs. And the list includes, and I think this is accurate from memory, includes agitation, anxiety, insomnia, irritability, also panic attacks. And then it goes on, and that's the real stimulant syndrome, where you're getting anxiety and panic and insomnia and agitation. And then it goes on to describe what is the aggressive syndrome: irritability, hostility, and aggressivity, and something we don't have in this case, which is akathisia. We have all the others, pretty much.
Objection, Your Honor.
Sustained, that last answer
Can-
as to you have all the others is stricken.
Can you explain when you
I
went?
didn't finish.
Oh,
And
please.
then it goes to hypomania and mania. And I think that's the entire string of these, but that's not all that's in the warning section.
And can you tell us when you say irritability, what is irritability?
Irritability in psychiatry is a much more intense thing than in general usage. It means reacting aggressively to an insufficient provocation.
And what about hostility as used?
Hostility is used there as it is used in common language. And aggressivity doesn't have any particular psychiatric.
In agitation?
Agitation is a psychiatric concept for a state of anxiety, irritability, excitement, feeling revved up.
And how about mania?
We have hypomania, which is just a lesser degree in mania. Mania is a state of hyperactivation of the human being, mentally and behaviorally. The mind is often, not always, I mean, you can have one part of this or another part. The three characteristics that are generally used are grandiosity and expansiveness and irritability. But it's best seen as the opposite of depression. The person feels all-powerful, devoted, excited. Judgment can be thrown to the winds. An individual might openly embezzle from a corporation when he's trained the people to actually find embezzlement in the corporation and be immediately caught. He's high, he doesn't know the trouble he's getting himself into. He's grandiose.
And what does grandiose mean?
It means you're thinking of yourself and your powers in ways that are wholly unrealistic. Omnipotence goes along with grandiosity. Often the person has a lot of energy and isn't sleeping well, but you don't have to have all of it by any means at all. People are commonly super planning. So while the planning is irrational, they are planning. It's actually a characteristic that they're pushing great plans. They're going to make a lot of money. They're going to do something very new and exciting. They're going to show the world. They're going to become a star overnight, or auto racer, or whatever the individual's ambition often becomes accomplished literally in the mania, in that person's mind. There's many other characteristics to it, but I think that captures. People often go from depression to mania.
And you said you used the word hypomania. What is hypomania?
Well, it's so common for people to have lesser degrees of mania and to have spotty symptoms. For example, their mind might just be racing, or they might just have got involved in some crazy plan that doesn't make any sense. That the concept of hypomania was developed to verify that lesser degrees of mania are a significant clinical factor.
In the adverse drug sections of the FDA, is that what you've just covered, or is that separate?
Yep, I haven't covered the warnings.
In terms of the warnings, would you please tell us what the warnings are?
Okay. To continue with the warnings, they make clear that the most serious adverse reactions of a psychiatric nature, because these are all psychiatric adverse reactions, that these occur often abruptly, that they occur often with dose changes up or down, or starting the drug. It's counterintuitive that a dose reduction could make things worse, but it makes sense when you look at the problem of the drug having one effect and the brain fighting back against it.
Objection, Your Honor. The question was about the warning, not
I will allow the answer.
Thank you.
Thank you, Your Honor. They mention as the time period within which you might get a dose change and an effect as several months, several. They talk a great deal about the necessity of looking at new and different behaviors. That is mentioned maybe 3 or 4 times in the warnings and precautions for changes in behavior. And they refer back to that list of activation several times to emphasize the importance of monitoring people regularly for these particular adverse events. There's a lot of emphasis
You
on
said
this.
activation, again?
That whole syndrome that starts with agitation and anxiety and panic attacks and goes on up to irritability and grand hostility and aggressivity and ends in and mania at the extreme end of the continuum.
And what is it about dose changes that are relevant to the activation?
It has to do with this balance. I think I've stated that. It has to do with this disrupting this balance of interaction between the brain, which is literally trying to do the opposite of the drug.
And you stated that it's a dose change either up or down?
It's up or down. And there isn't any, one thing that's missing that's important is there's no emphasis on size of dose.
And when you say size of dose,
Yeah, there isn't a great deal of emphasis on large doses more than small doses. The emphasis is on dose changes. Now, I think that, of course, larger doses are more dangerous of any drug, virtually almost any drug. But it isn't the emphasis. It's not what's been seen enough for the FDA to say, especially when you get into the larger doses. It's really all about the dose changes, and that's my experience, too.
and what do the adverse drug effect sections state?
Well, they repeat that there's a risk of violence and suicide, and of I think they mentioned psychosis, and I'd have to review that to look at it because that's kind of
Your memory is exhausted, Doctor?
But I'm reviewing just for a second.
Question is your memory exhausted?
Yes,
Thank you. You may now review. What document are you reviewing?
I'm looking at the Celexa label or full prescribing, and it's the adverse effects under psychiatric disorders.
Okay, review that to yourself, please.
Yeah. Okay,
Have you had a chance to review
Yeah.
that? Does that refresh your recollection?
yeah.
And could you now answer my question about the adverse drug effects section?
All right, the first group is called frequent. Frequent in FDA language means 1 in 100 or less. So it could be a lot, but it's got to be at least 1 in 100. That's the FDA for frequent. And they mention impaired concentration and amnesia, and then apathy and,
What?
apathy
Okay.
and depression and aggravated depression and suicide attempt and confusion.
And what is apathy?
Apathy is very similar to lethargy, to loss of interest, to a kind of social withdrawal. It's a not caring.
I'm sorry,
It's
not caring?
not caring. Empathy is gone. Interest is gone. Excitement, engagement, genuine engagement is gone. And all these are called frequent by the FDA. Infrequent, which is 1 in 1,000, and this is from their controlled clinical trials. These are 4 to 6 week trials, incidentally. So it's just from a very limited base, not from what it would be like in real life. Infrequent includes aggressive reaction, depersonalization, hallucination, psychotic depression, delusion, paranoid reaction, emotional ability, which is ups and downs, psychosis. Those are the infrequent. And the rare are, truly rare, are the catatonia and melancholia.
And the FDA warnings concerning children different, children and adolescents different than those for adults?
No, other than that the drug's not approved for children. They're not essentially different.
And the FDA labels about abrupt adverse changes in the drug effects. Could you explain that, please?
Yeah, and this is a point in the label and also in the medication guide. And it's that often these changes are rather sudden. Often enough for the FDA to comment on it. It's my clinical experience too. I don't think we know why. Something happens in that balance between the drug and the brain, and something goes over the top. I mean, I'm giving you a metaphor, not science. We don't really know why they're of abrupt onset. It's a characteristic of drug intoxications, of a number, not all, but a number of drug intoxications, that all of a sudden the person will get worse. But it's really noteworthy with the SSRIs. There, it's a phenomenon that you see again and again, and that the FDA and the medication guide mention.
And doctor, now let me ask you, does the liver function of an individual have an impact in connection with these drugs?
Liver function?
Liver function.
All right, thank you.
Yes, it does.
And how so?
The liver metabolizes, breaks down all of the SSRIs. That's how the drug eventually is destroyed in the body, most of it, a lot of it's destroyed, and then turned into something that can go out in the urine. It's not the kidney that's rendering the drug inoperative or preparing it for excretion. It's the liver that is controlling the rate at which this drug is going to disappear from the body.
So can you explain, if the liver is not functioning properly, how that affects?
You get a higher level in the bloodstream because the liver can't, with its enzymes, clear the blood as quickly of the drug so that it can, the remnants can then be expelled in the urine usually.
And how is one's weight loss, how does the drug effects in weight loss interplay?
Well, the smaller you are, the more an equivalent amount of drug will have an effect, but also the younger you are and the sicker you are, aside from just the liver. So that an individual who is weakened by anything, including an eating disorder, an individual who has a liver problem in particular, an individual who is smaller and younger is more susceptible to adverse effects of drugs. And that includes the discussion about frontal lobe development.
And are you familiar with are there any scientific studies covering the frequency of abnormal behaviors by individuals taking SSRIs?
The studies in children show extraordinarily high rates. Studies out of Harvard and Yale for things that we call activation, these stimulant effects, these aggressive effects, the hostile effects, the irritability, which is often the main effect, the biggest one. The rates run between 20 and 50% of the children they look at will have some of these effects. This is very unusual in medicine.
Can you describe apathy and emotional blunting and indifference?
The words are imprecise. There's a phenomena where human beings stop caring about themselves and other people, stop engaging in life and engaging genuinely with other people, and it gets called emotional blunting. They're not having feelings about themselves and other people. It's called apathy. It's called indifference. It's called lethargy and lassitude. And it's a definite effect of the SSRIs, especially over a period of time of exposure of months, especially though it can start early. It's also called the apathy syndrome.
Now, Doctor, from your engagement, did you do a clinical analysis in connection with this case?
I did.
Can you please describe what information you reviewed?
Let me locate the clinical analysis. Let me talk about the materials first, what I did.
Yes, please, if you tell the court what you did.
First, I reviewed the medical record, every single available medical record
Of whom?
for Michelle Carter and also for Conrad Roy. I evaluated every available phone or text message or Facebook message for both people. I got Michelle's educational records. I read the materials that were generated by the police, the original hearing that they held about Michelle. I forget what that word, it's a very common word,
We can skip the word, but
and I reviewed the materials and the report of the Massachusetts Appeals Court that the case went to. I reviewed all the available police records about the case. I interviewed half a dozen people in great detail who knew Michelle, many of them adults who knew her best up to age 12, because after age 12 she begins to relate more and more just through texting. She's relating very intensely to her peers.
and why do you do interviews?
I wanted to get the baseline for Michelle's behavior objectively viewed by other people. Did Michelle do mean, angry, or hostile things? Did she have any of the characteristics of an oppositional or defiant child, or or an adolescent, or even any antisocial behaviors of any kind? Was she likely to get angry and hurt people, or animals, or anybody? So I wanted to get a baseline. Was she a helpful, kind, loving human being? How was she viewed? And the before age 12 was key to me, because at 12, she actually, during her 11th year, she begins to develop anorexia, and in her 12th year, she's put on Prozac. So after that, we have two very different things going on that needed to be looked at. Can I discuss what I found, or?
Well, in terms of when you interviewed people to determine her baseline before she went on an SSRI.
Yeah, and these people also knew her afterward, many of them. One was a next-door neighbor who knew her since she was age 1, no, 0, when she was born, and whose daughter still knew her, so she still came over to the house. So I found one adult who was in close proximity to Michelle. Another was a mentor who later went on to be a teacher, and who stayed somewhat in touch with Michelle, knew her best when she was younger, and who actually became a friend, went from being a mentor and a coach to being a friend. And a number of the people I talked to were coaches who were independent of the school system, and who were business people who coached her softball team. Softball is a very big deal in her small town. They have championship softball teams. One of them was a school teacher who did work with her after she was 12, when she was older. That gives you a range of the folks.
And did you have opportunity to review the various text messaging from Michelle Carter and other individuals?
Yes, I got text messaging between her and everybody else she was texting, apparently.
And you've had an opportunity to review that?
Yes.
Okay. And how's that play into your clinical analysis?
Well, it enables me to look at, does her character and nature as described by other people before age 12, does it continue? Is she continue to be a very loving, very caring, extraordinarily helpful, unusually loved and appreciated person in the texting as she was in the in all of her activities outside the texting? And so that was important. And the texting, particularly with her friends, also shows a side that wasn't apparent anywhere else, which is that of a very troubled youngster underneath it all. And that's from the parents didn't know about this, the teachers didn't know about this, the coaches didn't know about this. This was going on between her and her peers and kept largely from the adults.
And did that have significance to you ultimately forming certain opinions in this case?
Yes, well, it shows her to be a very vulnerable person. It shows her to be a person struggling with suicide of her own after she's begun on Prozac. It shows her to be somebody who gets increasingly stressed and who does severe cutting in order to control her pain, and who is talking with others who've had the same problem or struggling with their own disorders, and helping each other. There isn't a lot of terror going on. The evolving relation with Conrad, which is different relation.
And you reviewed the
Everything that
You did have some answer in clinical analysis.
is. So, very beginning,
You said again, Doctor, do you start which you to review those?
yeah. The, I do need a little review of me.
Did you remember the when which
A lot of it started Facebook texting in October, then a little bit in 2012.
Facebook, you should review Facebook communications.
And
You got all
yes, that's the most. Um, and
in October of 2012, did that have some significance?
she tells him that he's hopeless, that nobody can help him, that she can't help him. And this goes on and on and on over hours and hours and pages of text. And she gets more and more desperate. And she's a little girl. She says, I have to go now. I think she was going to practice. And she's desperate about what to do. And
how is this relevant to your clinical analysis of this case?
well, it has to do with the effects of Conrad on what will eventually become her idea taken from him that he's going to kill himself and that all he cares about is doing it swiftly and quickly and not botching it, as because by the time we get to the end, he's at about 4 different attempts. And also how to build a relationship with her, a very dark one, that will end up with him in heaven and them communicating with each other, and that this is a good and glorious goal.
And did you review other electronic communications other than in October of 2012 between Michelle and Conrad
Yeah.
that had some particular clinical relevance to your
Yeah.
opinions?
I'd like to get out some materials to just refresh on and have it my side. Is that okay?
All right, why don't we take a morning recess? We'll resume at 5 minutes past 11, and you can assemble those documents.
Thank you.
and read them. Thank you very much.
All rise. Question session. Please silence cell phones and place them away.
All right, you may resume when you are ready, Mr. Cataldo. I remind you, Dr. Breggin, you remain under oath, sir.
Thank you.
Dr. Breggin, I'd like to take a step back for a minute. When did Michelle Carter start consuming SSRIs?
She started Prozac on February 17, 2011, 10 milligrams, and she's just a young girl then.
February 11th of what year, sir?
2011.
2011?
2011. I said she was 12. I was getting dates and things mixed up in my head, but she was 14 going on 15.
Okay, thank you.
And she was on Prozac for for eight months at that point. This is her first exposure to Prozac. It was it was rather abruptly raised. Start on the February 17, on the 23rd, it's up to 20 milligrams. And then
Go to 20 milligrams, I'm sorry.
on the 23rd,
Of,
I'm sorry, February 23rd, 2011,
okay, so it doubled in about 10
Just-
days?
6 days.
All right, okay, thank you.
And then on April 5th, it was raised to 30 milligrams, which is a high adult dose. It's getting into the upper adult doses, which is the standard is 20 milligrams. And then she was weaned off of it, and by the end of October 2011, she's no longer on Prozac. She has a drug-free break of 6.5 months, and she is concerned again about her weight, her anorexia, and on May 8th, 2012, she goes to a new doctor. These are primary care doctors, and her medication is restarted, and she's on it for 18.5 months. 18.75 months, to be exact. It's in this period that the available texting and Facebook will show some very abnormal reactions, similar to what we expect from Prozac. In December of 2013, the Prozac was stopped abruptly this time. There was no taper. There was a taper the first time. So we have an abrupt stop. The records then are quite confused about her starting Celexa, when it starts. They talk about it on December 27th, 2013. Doesn't start then. First,
Does not stop then, did you say?
yes,
Okay,
I think that looking at the electronic records and looking at the medical records, she's restarted, and it may be her first start, on April 1st, 2014. Because at that time, it's written in that she's going to do 1/2 tablet for 1 week, which is how you start, and then go to 10 milligrams. And on page, it's so important, Your Honor, I thought I'd help with it. On page 1167,
Doctor, just stick to the
that I was
medical.
going to give the time, where it is.
Okay, sure.
It's on 1167, which is April 1st. Michelle says that she's talking to the doctor about starting Celexa and why. Because it will help her eat more. So I take that to be the most accurate date, April 1st, 2014. And that's from Michelle Carter's LG Phone Timeline, Book 1.
And then are there other changes up until or after July 12th of 2014?
Well, for 1 week, she'll be at the 5 milligrams. She'll reach 10 milligrams on April 8th, and that's where I think we can date the change to, which is well within the several month concept of drug changes causing problems. That's on April 8th, and Conrad will die on July 13th, or be found at least on July 13th. Probably died July 12th. And she's continued on Celexa at 10 milligrams for several months until March 9th. Well, when
March 9th, though,
2015.
Okay.
And at that point, the note in the record says, has only been taking 5 milligrams and seems fine. So she'll be continued on 5 milligrams for a lengthy period of time until December of 2015. So she's exposed to the Celexa throughout that period of time until she's begun to taper it herself and has stopped at the end of December 2015. It's a 4-year period of big hiatus of 6.5 months. And then a brief one when she goes from Prozac to Celexa of a few months.
Thank you, Doctor. Now, directing your attention back to your clinical, analysis and the importance of various electronic communications between Michelle and Conrad, where we left off at the break. We were looking at certain Facebook records, were you?
Yes, sir.
Were there any ones that, in particular, that you placed importance on in your clinical analysis?
Yes.
And could you describe it?
By the way, I mentioned that the Facebook begins on 10/10/12. That's actually when I begin to cite it. It does start in July.
I want to know what you reviewed. So you started reviewing the records as of 10/10/12?
No, July
So you want to
16th.
correct your earlier testimony?
Yeah.
When did you, at what point in these Facebook records did you begin to review them?
I started right at the first page,
Which is?
July 16th, 2012.
Thank you very much.
But I'm going to go to the beginning of significant change, which was October 10th, 2012.
And that's what you covered in your prior testimony a few minutes ago, or is this in addition to?
No, this is looking at the actual documents from that time.
Okay.
And Conrad has been hospitalized for a suicide attempt 7 days earlier. It's his first attempt, and it is described as surrounding the divorce of his parents.
And does that have significance in terms of your clinical analysis?
Well, yes, he is now a very distressed young man. He's a very distressed young man. He's got a lot of family conflict that he's dealing with, that the family is dealing with. And, of course, his being distressed will increase the family's distress. And on 10/3/12 was the hospitalization. On 10/10, he tells her, stayed in the hospital last week. It's a complete shock to her. She says, why? And he says, because I'm weak and sensitive and don't know why you like me. He says, yeah, I tried to kill myself. And she says, why didn't you tell me? He goes on to tell her that he's going to kill himself that night. And he says, it's just letting you know the voices in my head tell me to. So now Michelle, who's a youngster, who's on Prozac at the time, is dealing with this huge disclosure. And he is saying, I'm not who you thought I was. This huge disclosure that he's troubled, and furthermore has announced to her that voices are telling himself to kill himself tonight. And it has something to do with the numbers of the date, the 10/10/11, 10/10/12.
And there are other Facebook records that you, in your clinical analysis, put some importance on during this time frame.
Yeah. Well, Michelle becomes desperate and this goes on for a long time on this day. You're not going to, Conrad. I bet $1 million you won't. It reminded me what a child she was when she said that.
Objection, Your Honor.
Sustained. That last answer is stricken.
Okay. So
What's
she,
the importance of this exchange for your clinical analysis?
well, he replies, I am. And she says, how are you gonna? And he replies, I've got
Doctor,
two.
the question is not for you to read me these statements. The
Okay.
question is, how does it import your clinical analysis?
Thank you, Your Honor. I'll get in that rhythm. She's been confronted with somebody whom she loves very, very much. She's a helper. Her whole life is helping. Everybody says. Just about everybody. She's the biggest helper. She lives to help people and make them happy. And this boy that she loves, whom she's seen twice and has been communicating with, now says, in the face of her grave distress, that he is going to kill himself, and it's going to happen tonight, and that he's even got plans. It's an intolerable position for her to be in. What does the person who helps everybody do?
You know, there are other time frames in the Facebook records that you have put in particular importance on your clinical analysis.
He talks about hanging himself that night, and she says, you're not going to, Conrad, stop. So she's totally wanting to stop him from hurting himself.
And just in terms of the timeline of the Facebook records.
This is still on the same day.
Right, and I'm just saying, I understand what you're saying there, but are there other time frames on the Facebook records?
You mean skipping this time?
Yes, that's exactly what I mean.
Okay, well, we would go ahead. To a month later.
And can you tell us what you're referring to at this point?
Well, I'm again looking just at their Facebook communications. And Conrad has been hospitalized again. He tells her that that last night he dreamed he was in heaven with you and people, and that I fell down to earth and went to hell. And this is the beginning of what will become.
Objection, Your Honor.
Sustained.
In terms of your clinical analysis and reviewing this time frame in the Facebook records, what particular importance did you put on this exchange?
Michelle picks up on the theme
What theme?
of going to hell. She tells him first to reassure him. She's reassuring all the time, you're going to go to heaven. And then she tells him, I'm going to hell. And she says to him, the devil told me, I swear it.
And what significance do you have in your clinical analysis of this?
She's following his lead, whether this actually happened or not. She's following his lead into a very dark place.
And in terms of your timeline and your clinical analysis, are there other parts in the Facebook records that are of importance to you?
Well, Conrad says that he actually saw the devil in the hospital. She's only seen him in a dream. But he's seen the devil in the flesh. And he goes on to tell her that, isn't it amazing that they're together, and she's had a dream, and he's seen the devil. The devil brought them together. And this is very frightening to her, and she says...
Objection, Your Honor, to the characterization of how she would have been feeling.
Not as to how Ms. Carter is feeling, sir. Again, the question is, what is the clinical significance of this discussion relative to information from the source these children both identify as the devil?
She's being drawn into the idea that they are meant to be together by the devil.
And
That is said explicitly, and they are victims of the devil. That's from Conrad.
And then are there other time frames on this continuous communication between Conrad Roy and Michelle Carter that you have placed particular clinical importance on?
Will we go to November, no, go further on.
Take your time, sir.
Thank you, Your Honor. In 2013, on this is October 11th, 2013, so we're way ahead now. And Michelle says to him, "Why have you been ignoring me?" No answer. "Do you think we will get married?" Conrad responds, "Are you okay?" She says, "Yeah, why?"
For you, doctor, what's the clinical importance of that?
Michelle is a young woman in love with this man who is really, with hundreds of texts, been talking about killing himself continuously, on and off. And she, who wants to help him desperately, and who is young and on Prozac, wants to marry him. This is very bad judgment, obviously. She's very vulnerable to him, and he doesn't want to marry her.
And then moving on, doctor, were there anything else in the Facebook records of particular importance to your clinical analysis?
I think that covers the Facebook, but it's just a taste of a lot of what's going on.
Right. And in terms of your clinical analysis, there was other communications that you reviewed, is that right?
Yep.
And there were text messages?
Yeah.
And were there certain text messages between these two individuals that you placed particular clinical importance to or on?
Yes.
Could you please describe?
This is from Michelle Carter's LG Phone Timeline, Book 1. And I'm looking at, this begins, for your information, Your Honor, at 10/7/2013. 10/7/2013. Sort of picking up after the Facebook. And on October 8th, he is continuing with the theme. He says, "I feel hopeless."
Can we get a year on that, please? October 8th.
I'm sorry, this is a text from whom to whom?
This is from Conrad to Michelle on October 8th, 2013 at 4:50 p.m., which will help to identify him. He says, "I feel hopeless." She says, "Do you still feel the same way you have been feeling? Like, has anything changed?" "Yeah, it's bad. I've tried to feel fine. I'm not, though." "Did you get a new psychiatrist?" "He cancels my appointments all the time." "Yeah, you need to get a new one fast." 3 exclamation points. "He doesn't want to see me." "Get a new one, I'm serious." "I'll try." "You need to." Conrad then says, "He hates me." She says, "Who?" "The psychiatrist." Ha ha.
And what is the clinical importance to you of seeing that exchange?
We see that he remains communicating despair and desperation to her and telling her that he's not getting any help. He thinks the psychiatrist hates him. And she's trying to help. She's saying, you know, you got to get a new one. You got to take care of yourself.
And moving on from that one, Doctor, any other particular text messages that you put particular clinical importance on?
We go now to 10/18/2013, 8:16, and it's Conrad. It's Michelle to Conrad. I'm beginning to have the same thoughts as you. Conrad, what thoughts? To Conrad, like IDK, like I don't know if I want to kill myself. He says, oh shit, I'm sorry.
And what is the clinical importance that you placed upon that?
She's openly stating that she's having the same thoughts as him. She's under his influence.
Objection, Your Honor.
Sustained as to her being under his influence. The remainder of that answer, however, will stand.
Yes, Your Honor. Thank you.
And moving on, Doctor, were there other text messages, that highlights of these text messages that you place clinical importance towards?
On 11/15/2013, at 8:46, she's expressing to him a strong desire to live closer, that he's her best friend, that she's never given up on him. And she says, quote, try my best every day to think of ways to help you. And I just wish you knew how much you mean to me. Please answer. And he responds, I'm sorry.
And what's the clinical significance of that, Doctor?
Again, she is just compulsively attached to saving him, to helping him, to doing everything she can for him. He is giving very little in return to sustain her.
And moving on from that, Doctor, to other text messages, highlights of other text messages that you put particular importance on.
On 12/19/2013, 8:19, Michelle says, how are you and how are things? He says, good and bad. She says, why good and why bad? From Conrad, my dad's pissing me off lately. To Conrad, why is he saying? What is he saying? Conrad, yelling, screaming, punching, I can't take it, I'm living with my mom now. Michelle, he's punching you? From Conrad, yeah. To Conrad, why is he doing like that? What's causing him to act that way? Conrad says, I enjoy smoking weed.
Is there something in particular about marijuana in SSRIs in depressed people?
Marijuana is notoriously depressing drug, especially in depressed people. It is also a drug which can induce psychosis or worsen psychosis. The worst thing he could be doing, and almost in terms of putting things in his body right now, is smoking marijuana.
Moving on the timeline in the various text messages, are there other text messages that you put particular importance to, Doctor?
There's a discussion on January 18th, 2014, in which basically he's asking for sex, but he's saying, I probably won't date you.
And what is the significance in your clinical analysis and importance of that?
Her judgment, she's pursuing somebody who's not in many ways encouraging her, although he calls her. she's pursuing somebody who's suicidal, somebody who won't marry her, somebody who won't date her. She's in a very dependent and rather helpless relationship here.
And then turning on to other highlighted portions of the text messages that you place clinical importance on, could you go through another one, please?
We go to February 22nd, 2014, at 9:27. Conrad says to her, "I'm lonely." No, I'm sorry, she says to Conrad, "I'm lonely." Conrad says, "Okay," with a question mark. She says, "So talk to me." He says, "Nah." NaH. She says, "You're mean." And she goes on, "This summer we can hang out a lot, please?" Then Conrad sends 2 blank messages. This third message is, "Get a car."
And what's the clinical, in your judgment, the clinical, excuse me, in terms of your clinical analysis, the importance of that exchange?
Well, she, in her mind, has to help him, has to keep him alive, believes she loves him, and she's getting frustrated by him again and again and again. He's saying, no, nah, not interested, but he keeps talking with her.
And then next, can you go to another text message that you put particular clinical importance on, Doctor?
On March 24th, 2014, at 9:43, talking to a friend, a girlfriend, she, for the first time that I can find in the texting, says, "Okay, well, when I was suicidal, I tried committing suicide. I tried to hang myself." This is Michelle talking. "I got a chair and the rope and everything and researched how to tie the stupid knot. And, parentheses, shit, I'm crying. I'm like crying right now. This is why I didn't want to tell you in school. I would have bawled my eyes out." End parentheses. "I got up on a chair and stood there for like 25 minutes just crying, and I put the rope around my neck, and I was going to do it, but I chickened out and got off the chair and like threw shit around my room everywhere. I was so angry, frustrated, and disgusted with myself for not having the balls to do it."
Your voice dropped down too much, Doctor.
Yeah, yeah.
And what is
I
the-
was so angry. We could actually end it there. And she goes on to say she still has the rope in the closet and she just can't bear to go in there. She dates it to a year and a half earlier, which brings it to, by my recollection, after being started on Prozac.
And going on to another highlighted particular text that you have clinical, in your judgment, clinical importance, what would that be?
On March 27th, 2014, which is just a few months before his death, she says that her nightmares are contributing to this, meaning to all of her eating problems.
If I could ask who this is to, because the last text message was not to Mr. Roy, it was to somebody else.
I'm sorry, this is to a girlfriend.
3/24/2014, 9:43 reference, he specifically indicated he was talking to a girlfriend.
She was talking to her.
Yes.
Ms. Carter was talking to a
Right.
girlfriend.
Just wanted to
Is that a
clarify.
correct characterization of your testimony?
Yes,
Doctor?
sir.
All right, so now on this 3/27 event,
She's
Is-
talking to the same girlfriend.
she's talking to the same girlfriend. Thank you.
The nightmares are probably the most one of the very most common effects of Prozac and SSRIs. And her nightmares, which began with the devil, are continuing.
And next, Doctor, to another text message of importance to your clinical analysis.
Where she goes into a period of cutting which just covers many, many weeks during this period of April and May and June.
So that's just various text messages where she's talking about cutting.
Yeah, and she talks to her girlfriends about this. She never communicates to adults about it. And the friends, they're like a isolated peer group that isn't bringing in the adults. And they're trying to save each other and help each other. And her friends are trying to stop her from cutting. At one point, one friend comes and takes her knife away at Michelle's invitation. And Michelle says she starts using razors. It goes on, it's complex. And it's the same girlfriend who takes the knife away. And that is on April 2nd, 2014, 11:02.
And then moving on, Doctor, to the next, in the timeline, the next text messages that you put clinical importance to or highlighted.
Well, there's a whole series. An example is on April 10th, 2014, that she's many girlfriends and some boyfriends who are rallying around her. They're all saying stuff consistent with what the mostly adults were saying about her in my interviews, how much they love her, how wonderful she is, how much they don't want to hurt herself. She's communicating back how much she loves them and wants to help them, and she's helping them. In the middle of all this, she's going out of her way. At one point, as we move along, there's a young man dying of cancer, and she's calling him, and at least he's very ill with it. He's so grateful. So she's being Michelle on a very intense level with her friends, loving, being loved, and they're worried about her at this point. They're worried. And that's just multiple places they're worried.
And then moving on, Doctor, to a further future date from where you were at. Is there another text message that you highlighted of particular clinical importance to your evaluation?
Yes, we go to May 8th, 2014. She's having more and more trouble. Her weight's going up. And she says on 5/8/2014 at 7:03 to a different girlfriend, but I feel like I'm giving up on myself.
And what is the clinical importance for you of that remark?
Her eating disorders are getting worse. The relationship with Conrad is sporadic and not good. She's getting more desperate. She attributes it to the eating disorders, but very often the eating disorder gets markedly worse right after a phone call from Conrad.
And then next in your clinical analysis, are there any text messages, for instance, in June of 2014, unless there was another one in May?
Well, we can go to June. On June 1st, Michelle, well, I'll read it to you. It's self-explanatory. To Conrad. And the time here is 6/1/2014 at 5:42. Have you thought about getting professional help? Like I'm thinking I'm going to go away to a place for my eating disorder to help me overcome it and stuff. The place also deals with psychiatric problems and disorders too, so they can help you over some of this. I think it will really help you, and we can go together, so we will be there for each other. Conrad says, where are you going? It's called McLean Hospital in Belmont, Massachusetts. I honestly think it would be so good for you, and we would get through our issues together. Think about it. You aren't going to get better on your own. You know it no matter how many times you tell yourself you are. You need professional help like me, like not meaning like I'm professional, like me, like I'm getting professional help. People who know how to treat and fix it.
And what is the importance that you place upon that, doctor, in your clinical analysis?
Well, she's getting worse. She perceives him as getting no better or worse. And being Michelle, everything she does has a helping aspect to it. So she's going to go to the hospital, and she wants him to go to the hospital, and everything in her mind is wrapped around him. So it's going to be, wants to get him to go and be there with her, because she's vulnerable. It's hard for her to make her own decisions, hard for her to push on without support. That's her vulnerability, and her strength is, I want to help you. So she's got this vulnerability and the strength.
And moving on in June, are there other text messages that you place clinical importance
Yes.
on, that you highlight?
Later on, explaining this to him at 7:59, she says, I'm scared for you that you aren't going to get better and you'll become suicidal again and stuff.
And are there other ones in June
Yeah.
of 2014
Yes.
that you highlighted of importance?
And the importance of this is 30 days before a dramatic change. She's still Michelle here. It's a lot of love and caring continuing. It's not a lot content with Conrad Roy. She's talking with her friends about going to the hospital. And she makes a determination around June 2nd, and it's discussed around that period of time, of 2014 at 10:24, that she is actually going to go to McLean and miss the last 2 weeks of school. And her friends are saying, that's crazy, why are you going to do that? And she's saying, I have to go. I gotta go.
And the importance that you placed on that in your clinical analysis is what?
She's becoming more frightened for herself, more helpless, more in need of help. Her friends can't do it for her. They keep telling her, we can't do it for you, even though they keep trying to do it for her. Well, she's trying to help them too.
And are there others in June that you, clinical importance?
She originally doesn't tell her mother about these plans, and the kids say to her, they say, tell your mother. So she finally tells her mother, but as of June 2nd, she still hasn't told her father. She's having a lot of trouble reaching out to parents, which is a characteristic of teenagers and every one of them in the book. They're all reaching out to each other. She is pinning her hopes on the new approach. She gets an intake at McLean on June 4th. And she's feeling good because she's saying to herself on June 4th, and this is at June 4th at 8:27, that she's trying to make this her own decision, and that's one of the reasons she's not communicating so much with her parents. One of her friends, yet a third girlfriend, says, are your parents making you go, or do you want to go? She says, I want to. It was my decision. It's like the first time in my life that I actually am helping myself. My mom sort of hinted last month that I was going to need professional help, and I thought I could fix it on my own, but I realized I can't and I need help. This is fairly typical teenage behavior. I can do it on my own, but this is very extreme. She's so desperate now, she wants to go to a mental hospital.
And are there other text messages of clinical importance, doctor, that you've highlighted in June?
Well, yes. She's talking with Sam. I don't want to mention names. She's talking with her friend. It's a girlfriend.
Now, what's the date of this, please?
June 4th, 2014.
Thank you.
At 10:42. And she's talking about the hospital. And she's hoping it's not too far for her friends to come visit her. And then she says, and I'm happy to, help out other people. She means in McLean. 2, because I've had all the eating disorders, haha. So I can help out everyone struggling with each of them because I understand them all. I've been through them. And I'm sure at least one other person there is for binge eating disorder too. So it would be nice to talk with them about it.
And the clinical importance that you put on that, doctor, is what?
Even going to the hospital, she's imagining how she's going to help other people. She's imagining making a friend, a contact, another woman, another girl, a young woman. This is still Michelle. And we're now at June 4th. This is still Michelle, who's only helping people get over their issues.
You know, there are other text messages in June of clinical importance to you that you've highlighted.
Her friends are praising her and loving her and congratulating her and sharing that they've had anorexia or they've had this or they've had that. Here's one that is really very typical, and this is from a boy who isn't involved a lot in the texting. Oh, no, I'm sorry. This is her to the boy. This is typical of how she praises other people. You're amazing, then his name. Honestly, I'm so thankful and blessed to have you in my life. It makes this a lot easier knowing that I have you by my side through this and that you believe in me. I care so much about you too and your health. I'm so happy you opened up to me. I will be here for you with anything and everything forever. I'm so proud of you for being to where you are now. It's really inspiring to me. If you can do it, so can I. Smiley face.
And the clinical importance of that?
She's still Michelle. She's relating with all her heart. She is constantly telling people how wonderful they are, over and over again. And they're constantly telling her. Meanwhile, Conrad knows that she's going into McLean. We saw that from the text. He stops texting her throughout this period, pretty much. Maybe there's one or two somewhere.
And in terms of June, other June 2014 text messages that you've highlighted as particular importance?
On June 7th, we hear from Conrad. And he's nice to her. He says, congrats on going. She says, I'm nervous, but thank you. He says, you'll be fine. She says, I hope so. I'll talk to you for support when I need it. And they have a conversation. And then it goes in that direction again of, and I'll quote this a little bit. To Conrad, do you, let me, from Conrad, keep dreaming. And she says, I do. And from Conrad, do you remember? And she says, remember what? Conrad says, dreams. And now she says to Conrad, I don't have dreams. And Conrad says, BS. And she says, it wasn't BS at one point. When? You know what I'm talking about. Smiley face from him. And he says, ha ha, it's not happy. And she says, what's up? And he says, bored.
Your voice is trailing down.
He says,
right now.
bored. And she says, same. And then she says, why didn't you tell me you graduated? So she found out from somebody else that he's graduated high school.
And are there other text messages during this time that you put clinical importance to?
Yes, on June 18th, which is just 12 days from the transformation, she is talking to friends about her history of having had anorexia and then having become bulimic. She doesn't vomit, maybe once or... What she does is she exercises. She runs untold miles a day, constantly exercises to lose weight. And that's to a pathological point, and that's considered bulimia. I don't see exactly what the connection is, but Conrad pops in and says to her, if I don't end up in the hospital, ha ha. And she's worried again. Are you gonna? I'm so happy you said that, like I want you to go, and I think it will help you so much, and I'm gonna visit you as much as I can. That's okay. And he says, if you want. No, and that's it. That's the end of the communication.
In the clinical significance of that, Doctor?
Well, I think he actually isn't saying, I want to go to the hospital.
Objection, Your Honor.
Sustained.
Thank you.
That answer is stricken.
And was there another text message you put clinical importance to, Doctor, that you highlighted and particularly noted? And as you're looking, Doctor, is it fair to say that there are dozens, if not hundreds, if not more, text messages that you're skipping over, you're just highlighting particular ones?
Yes.
Okay.
There's tons of them. On June 19th, 2014 at 10:34, and she says to him, you said nothing is that bad. Well, what's the thing that will make it bad? He says, I said I won't. I've thought about it, but I know seek down I will not. It's confused. She takes it as reassurance. Okay, good. And then he says, yeah, I just feel so alone. She says, I'm here, babe. If we lived closer, you know I would be with you as much as I could. I never want you to feel alone. To Conrad, we need to go on a date. Conrad would reply, or just hanging out can be our date, LOL, which can mean lots of laughter or lots of love. From Conrad, I mean, like, I've never found myself out yet, and it's scary. Most people do by now, he says. And she says, I haven't really found myself out either. Don't worry. We will someday. We will. We have time. From Conrad. Yeah, but it feels like it's too late for me. To Conrad, it's not too late. I promise.
And are there others that you put clinical significance to later on in June of 2014?
She starts out saying to Conrad on June 19th, later, we're at 11:20. From Conrad, I feel brain dead. To Conrad, how? Because you forget things? And he writes back, constable negative thoughts. Constant, it's supposed to be.
Objection, Your Honor.
Sustained. The last answer is stricken.
I'm sorry, Your Honor, I'll stop that. To Conrad, that doesn't mean you're brain dead. From Conrad, that's how I feel, IDK. And she then emails Conrad something off the web about handling anxiety symptoms and bad thoughts. She then emails Conrad something about social phobia. She then emails Conrad something, not emails, texts, something about anxiety symptoms and memory problems, and Conrad says, thanks.
In the clinical, the importance of that to your clinical analysis is?
Well, we're very near the transformation. It's less than 2 weeks. She's still helping. She doesn't want him to commit suicide.
Are there others in June moving along?
On 6/20, at 2 o'clock, Conrad says, as bad as it sounds, like it kills me to say this, but I kind of wish I didn't exist. I feel like I can't get out of it because it's too late and I don't have the patience, and I just don't like talking to people. I feel like I have nothing important to say, and I'll always feel down. Like IDK, it's really hard to explain. But I really want to change myself, but my depression is restricting it, and I just hate the person I become. Like, really, things would have been a lot better if I wasn't so shy. I'd feel more comfortable talking to people and sharing my own ideas because I feel like I don't have an opinion on THIN and then an ND. I view myself as a waste of space and a waste of good opportunity. It all leads to my shyness. I want to be able to have friends. And he goes on like this at great length.
So if you can skip ahead to some others further along in June, please. And I know, have you tabbed and highlighted certain other ones of importance in June?
It's, in this book, it's the one more.
Oh, Dr. I don't know if we're on.
I don't know, you recording?
Yeah, the recording's fine, Judge.
Oh,
All right,
okay.
good.
All right, go ahead.
Yes, there's one on the 21st where he tells her, my 6/21, 10:30, my head is constantly filled with negative thoughts and IDK memories that's driving me insane. It's controlling me, like MR mind just wants me to give up, but I know I can't.
You know, there are others in June.
Yeah, we go to another volume. On June 22nd, 2014 at 12:05, she's trying to cheer him up, and he says, give up, it's okay. I didn't mean give up like
Can you
complete.
go back and read what she said, and you referred to it as she tried to cheer him up?
Okay.
What did she say? What did he say in response?
That's a good question. I actually can't connect it. It's actually not clear. So
All right.
whether he's cheering, whether it's referring to cheering up or not
In
is,
that case, Doctor, if you can move on to another one. then-
well, I'd like to read what it says.
Okay.
Objection, Your Honor, if he can't connect.
Okay, move on to the next one, please.
Doctor, I know we're just asking for some of these highlights of
Yeah.
this, please.
She's sending in music. He's actually texting her from the psychiatrist's office. She texts back, "Don't be scared or sad. This is going to help you. And I want to see you so bad, too." Smiley face. "I'm sorry today didn't work. You never answered back last night." "Conrad, you don't get it. Myself just wants to die, but I can't." She says, "I do get it. Tell your therapist when you get one. Maybe they can help you more than I can because they're professional and know what to do. I know you, and I know you don't think you're strong enough to do this, but you are." He says, "Thanks."
And are there others that you put clinical importance to later on in June?
She's pleading with him to please not hurt himself on June 23rd at 1:44. This is 7 days before the transformation.
And continuing to move on in your clinical analysis, Doctor, are there other ones later on in June?
On June 26th, from Conrad at 3:52, "My life is an abortion." And then he says later, "I just feel like my life's a joke." And then on 6/26, he says, "My negative thoughts have controlled me to the point where I'm legit going insane." And he says, and that's, I'm sorry, at 6/26 at 6:04, and a little earlier at 5:54, he says, "My best part of the day is when I get sleep and I dream, and then when I wake up, I'm in a nightmare again."
And are there others later on in June of clinical importance to you, Doctor, that you've highlighted?
Michelle is becoming increasingly distressed in the emails that follow,
You mean text messages?
in the text messages to her friends. And
And are there other examples
Yeah, she's-
later on in June between Michelle and Conrad that you put clinical importance towards?
on June 26th, 2014 at 7:37, Conrad says, "We could be like Romeo and Juliet at the end."
And what is the clinical importance of that to you, Doctor?
Well, Juliet kills herself along with Romeo.
And moving on in June of 2014, are there others?
on 6/27/2014, at 4:34, he tells Michelle, Conrad tells Michelle, I've made a new friend. The new friend is somebody in Britain whom I think he calls young or a kid, not sure, who works with helping people commit suicide. The friend, however, in the beginning starts out trying to prevent Conrad.
Objection, Your Honor, is he referring to a text message, or, I'm looking at them.
You're reading from the text message, correct? And
Yeah.
this is a text message from Conrad to,
No, I'm just sort of giving an impression
Well,
of
give it another-
Sever,
Then I object.
face with a line down. I am too. From Conrad, you're not suicidal though, are you? And she says, no, I'm not. And she says, I kind of used to be, but I'm not anymore, don't worry. He says, I am.
And then others later in June of 2014, there are one or two more that you put particular importance to, Dr.
Well, it goes on into this, so I'll zip ahead. Way ahead. There's a huge amount of texting going on between her and her friends, and sometimes,
But if you can just, before we talk about the
Well,
break, as you said, Doctor, just pick out a couple of more, please.
yeah. Yeah. No, actually, July 1 we're just about on July 1. That's July. So I'm finishing up June. On July 1, she says to Conrad, do you still have bad thoughts every day? Conrad says, what do you mean by bad? Negative, suicidal? Then Conrad, yeah, RLY, bad. To Conrad, about killing yourself? From Conrad, I think about it all day. It kind of feels like the only option. To Conrad, and you think smoking is going to change that? From Conrad, but like 2 months ago I was fine and felt fine about the future. I just can't get out of my head, which if I could, it would be a lifesaver, but nothing. Then down below, 7/1/2014 at 10:28, do you think you're actually going to do this? Yeah, prob. And then he says at 10:35, I might too.
Who says I might too?
He does. Then the day that's more or less a turning point, but one doesn't want to exaggerate, comes up.
Let me ask you now, Doctor, in your clinical analysis, you use this to help you to formulate certain opinions in this case?
Yeah.
And how did these text messages that you have just highlighted for, I guess, from roughly October 2012 up through July 1 of 2014, how did that work into your clinical analysis?
Well, she continues to be Michelle. She will try anything. Invite him
sorry, she
home.
continues to be Michelle. What was the second thing?
She will do anything to help. She'll date him. She'll invite him to her home, but he won't do either. She encourages him. She sends him information, not about how to kill yourself, how to get over anxiety, how to get over bad thoughts. She's constantly cheering him up as best she can. She feels deeply responsible for him, which is a characteristic of her in regard to other people. Part of it is her strength, but part of it is her vulnerability, that she just needs to be engaged with people and to help them. It's on a desperate level here now. Meanwhile, he gives her very little encouragement to build her up or to give her any strength. He's very negative about things like dating her or marrying her. And when she says, say you love me, he says, you love me. He's battering her in a way with negativity. And this is what she's trying to contend with as of this moment in time. What does somebody who wants to help with all her heart do in this situation? And then she goes grandiose. She goes out of control.
In terms, doctor, what is an involuntary intoxication?
Well, by definition, it's an intoxication, which means that the neurochemistry of the brain has been disrupted, and that this intoxication is observable through thoughts, behaviors, activities. It is something that takes preeminence over other diagnoses, so that if you have an intoxication, you can't say the person has something else, because the intoxication, something else operating at the moment in time, because the intoxication is causing sufficient disruption of brain function that the person isn't necessarily depressed or in some other state. The person's in an intoxication. And if you've gotten intoxication, then it's in effect ruling out other things. The intoxications are generally swift in onset. They can end quickly, but not with the SSRIs. They certainly can persist. They involve, in general, intoxications, things like impulsivity, impaired judgment, things of that nature. They can also involve physical things, like when a person is intoxicated with alcohol and is drunk, but that is not the meaning of this intoxication. That is, you could be intoxicated with alcohol and be staggering, but you can be intoxicated with many substances and not be staggering or drunk or dizzy or vomiting or any of the things that people associate with alcohol. So that's confusing. The term intoxication is used to cover a broad area of drugs and things, from insecticides to psychiatric drugs to a number of other substances used in medicine that can cross the blood-brain barrier and intoxicate. During an intoxication, a person is generally going to have loss of judgment, loss of maybe confusion, and often loss of memory for the specific event. It's sort of a general discussion of intoxication.
And how do you analyze and determine if somebody is involuntarily intoxicated by drugs?
Well, you first of all want to know if the drug can do it. Is this drug known to cause this kind of behavior? For example, does Prozac cause nightmares? Yes, frequently. Does Celexa and all the SSRIs cause marked changes in behavior? Behaviors that weren't there before the drug? Behaviors that look at times like activation, that is, the person's driven in some bizarre purpose and compulsively doing something, whether it's selling all their clothes or buying lots of cars or planning somebody's life for them, or trying to take over something. It's out of character. It often involves aggression and hostility. So we want to know, do the SSRIs do all this? And that's what we were looking at earlier, that the SSRIs, when they cause abnormal reactions, which involuntary intoxication would be the extreme,
Keep your voice up, please. for the
which involuntary intoxication would be the extreme, they cause agitation, they cause anxiety, they cause panic, they cause irritability, and she's going to get so irritable with them. Just suddenly so irritable with them. They cause hostility. We'll see hostility. We'll see anger. We'll see grandiosity. We'll see her deciding with him that she can help him. He wants to die. And he wants to die as painlessly as possible. And he wants to go to heaven. And he doesn't want his family to suffer. And she pronounces that she can do all of that. That she can even go to the family afterward and it'll be okay. She'll help the family. She's going to help it turn out exactly as he wants it. And he'll give her a sign. He won't tell her what it is, but he'll give her signs when he's gone. And she's going to carry on. This is into texts and be the best she can be and remember him and love him forever. And she actually tries to carry it all out.
And specifically, Dr. Breggin, as to Michelle Carter, did you form an opinion if she became involuntarily intoxicated by the SSRIs that she was consuming?
Yes. Let me shift around. May I take a moment, shift papers around?
May, sir. Before you get too far removed from the question, will you answer the question? Did you form an opinion?
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
I am looking for that portion of my report which discusses this in detail, because I want to get detail on this, and I'm having a little trouble locating it. Here it is. The wrong pile. Thank you for your patience.
And Doctor, specifically as to Michelle Carter, you did, to, I guess, re-ask the question, you did have an opinion of whether or not she was involuntarily intoxicated?
Yes.
And what is that opinion?
I'll do it from the top of my head. I'm not locating the materials. Yes, she was involuntarily intoxicated. She was taking Prozac, and she then switched to Celexa. During this time, we see her having adverse reactions to the Prozac. It is a remarkable nightmare series in which she is having nightmares about the devil, in which the devil actually tells her to kill herself. She is still so afraid of the devil that months later, she tells a friend that she still sleeps with her little doggy because he will scare the devil away. So she has a long-standing, not involuntary intoxication, it doesn't go to that extent, but toxic reactions or severe adverse effects, which are the same sort of synonyms.
And Doctor, in terms of this
Yeah.
opinion...
Is your answer complete?
I'm sorry.
Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay.
It seemed like both of you were talking at the same moment.
And in terms of your opinion that she became involuntarily intoxicated, are you able to pinpoint about when she became involuntarily intoxicated?
yes, on July 2nd, she begins to help him go to heaven in that period of time. And she begins to give him advice. She begins to get irritable with him. He'll go and he'll try and he'll complain that he couldn't do it again, and she'll encourage him, but she'll even get mad at him. So she's very irritable with him. But at this point, she has an involuntary intoxication where she is not forming a criminal intent. I'm going to harm him. She's not doing something she thinks is criminal. This is bad. She's found the way to use her unique power to help and to love, to help this boyfriend, in her mind, not in his, this boyfriend to not keep making mistakes and not hurting himself with, I think it was about 4 suicide attempts. She's actually going ahead and going to help him do it better, the way he wants, to reassure him he's going to heaven.
Is this opinion by you to a reasonable degree of medical certainty?
Yes.
And as a result of this involuntary intoxication that Michelle Carter suffered, do you have an opinion as to whether or not she could conform her actions and conducts to the requirements of the law?
I do.
And what is that opinion?
No, she couldn't. She was enmeshed in a delusional system of...
Sorry, she was what?
Enmeshed in really a delusion where she's thinking that it's a good thing to help him die, that she can mitigate the circumstances, reassure him he's going to heaven, that she can then go and help his family not mourn so severely, and a lot of other things that she's going to do to make it better, and to and then afterwards she continues with this for quite some time.
And do you see in your review of the texting that is post the time that she became involuntarily intoxicated, do you see certain manifestations of the drugs there?
Yes, she persists for 2 months in texting him as if he's alive. Well, she knows he's dead. She knows he's in heaven, so it's not as if he's alive, but as if she can communicate with him in heaven directly by texting.
And specifically in the beginning of July, the first 2 weeks of July, approximately.
It starts then.
Do you see what manifestations of the SSRIs do you see in Michelle Carter's texting?
She is in denial of the tragedy.
No, prior to his death, I'm asking.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, prior to his death, in the first 2 weeks of July 2014.
Well, do you want to go and look at those? You didn't
Well,
ask.
there was some testimony, Mr. Cataldo, that as of July 2nd, when Dr. Breggin maintains that she became involuntarily intoxicated, she gave him advice and was irritable with respect to him. So those are characteristics of what you determined to be involuntarily intoxicated, is that correct?
Yes.
Are there any others?
Well, overall grandiose. That is that she has this power she imagines. She, not even thinking about things like criminal responsibility or even whether it's bad, because she knows this is good. This is now the way. She's found a way to finally help. And she goes at it, and like anybody who is in a hypomanic state, she gets very angry when she's disrupted. This is a characteristic of mania. If you see somebody in a restaurant that's talking loudly, and you suggest to them that they get quiet, they're going to get really irritable and angry. And that's how a lot of the aggression in mania comes about. These people are so set on what they're going to do. They think they are perfect. They have achieved whatever status they can imagine achieving and power, and then they're going to be interrupted. It's a persistent planning and obsessive carrying out. All this is described in the diagnostic manual for mania, and in the same section, Your Honor, the diagnostic manual says, and SSRIs can cause these symptoms.
And do you see any signs after July 12th and 13th of 2014 of the SSRI effects on Michelle Carter.
Well, that's what I was starting to talk to, and
And could you please describe?
the texting is remarkable in communicating with him. She feels definitively that she's done a good thing. She's happily texting him. She does not expect him to be at all angry at her. She's not apologizing at that point. Later, she gets a little sad about it. I think it's wearing off. She is shallow in the way she's relating around these issues. It's not her, but there's still a lot of loving and caring going on with friends, because that never goes. She imagines him looking down upon her. She's told him that she's going to do something very nice for him. I'm not sure exactly when that was. But she's dedicated herself to being a better person, and she comes up with the idea that she's going to have a tournament which will honor him, a softball tournament, homers for Conrad or something like that. And contrary to this being selfish, she is telling Conrad, this is for you. This is for you. And the money I'm raising, it's for you. And it's clear that this is her own personal activity, what she's sending up to him. And then at about the second month,
So we're talking now August or September?
It would be August, I think.
I'm sorry,
But I can-
I just want to be clear, when you say too much from when?
Let me actually get a date for you. On September 14th, 2014, she texts to him that she's raised $2,500, that things are going wonderfully, and that they have begun their journey together of helping people. She's obsessed. It's beyond just empathy. It comes out of her vulnerability. She's got to be helping all the time. And then she stops texting. She started on a journey with him, and she stopped. We're now helping, and she stopped texting. It's all about her and him. It's not to impress somebody. It's all about that
Doctor,
tight-knit relationship.
If I can go back for a minute and ask you, do you have, to a reasonable degree of medical certainty, an opinion as to Michelle Carter's intent or lack of intent back when she was involuntarily intoxicated in the first couple of weeks of July 2014?
Objection.
Sustained.
Do you have an opinion as to her intent when she was
Wish to come to
involuntary?
sidebar?
Objection.
That's true. Doctor, was there anything about Michelle Carter's review of the materials that you did that was allowed you to opine of whether or not you came up with an opinion of her ability to form an intent?
Yes.
And what was that?
The most important thing is this amazing contemporaneous texting with her friends, but mainly at this point now with Carter, which
Now, at what point? There's
In
a lot
the
of points here. We're talking up to
July
Mr. Roy's
2nd
passing, or we're talking in the text which followed his passing?
well, I think you're asking me about July 2nd
To the
All right,
14th
okay,
of
just so
July.
we're
to
clear on that.
14th. Yep, thank you.
And what is your opinion as to her ability to form intent?
that she was unable to form intent because she was so grandiose that what she was doing was not to harm. It was not an intent to harm, even though she was encouraging a suicide. Her absolute intent was to help
Objection,
Conrad.
Your Honor.
Okay, and the last part will be stricken.
Okay.
Her purpose,
Hold on for another question.
Now, Dr. Breggin, turning your attention to Conrad Roy for a minute, did you have an opportunity to review certain materials pertaining to Conrad Roy?
yes.
And what materials did you review?
Well, I got to see a lot of hospital records, and I got to see a lot of police reports about domestic issues in the family. I got to see what supposedly is all available texting that he was doing, and Facebook communicating that he was doing.
And when you say hospital records, you also include in that psychiatric records?
Yeah, and I got to see the autopsy report, and I got to see the letter that he reportedly wrote at some time before his death to Michelle, a goodbye letter, which was important. And I got to look at his attempts to get treatment and the attempts of other people to give him treatment and what he told those people. And how much he tried to get help from them, you know, or didn't try to get help from them.
And Dr. Breggin, how does one's depression affect your willpower?
Depression tends to focus a person's willpower on actually being paralyzed. It's like a decision not to take actions under the influence of other people. One of the things about depression is that people who are in depression, and you see it with all of Conrad's medical records, they can't get him to talk to him. They can't get him to tell him what's troubling him deeply. They can't get him to tell that he has suicidal plans. He keeps saying, no, I don't.
And on that, Doctor, just so I'm clear, suicidal plans differ from suicidality and suicide ideation. Can you explain the differences between those?
Well, they're all of a category. The issue is that when you go from ideation, when you go from thinking about, I'd like to kill myself, to I have plans, you've taken a very hazardous step. And he's had plans all the way back as early as way early in going back to October, after his
Going back to?
October 2012, after his first hospitalization, he's talking to Michelle about having 3 different plans, including hanging himself. He's got all these plans all the time, or much of the time, that we can see him at least, hear him. And he never says to people who are trying to help him, I have plans. He doesn't even tell them when they ask specifically who we're talking to, that he knows anybody named Michelle. He names other people. So he is sealing off Michelle, as Michelle's sealing off herself, and nobody can get him out of that shell, and then he opens it for Michelle only. She's the only one that's getting to hear all this terrible, terrible stuff. Other people know he's depressed, they know he's anxious, but he's not telling them this stuff.
Hey, Doctor, what are the conditions required for somebody's will to be overborne?
Well, there's many different conditions that come into play. First, and many of them are social and cultural. They're both on medication, so that's probably a wipeout. if you medicate somebody against their will, you can influence them, but not in this situation where they're both taking medication. They're taking the same kind of medication. Usually there's a difference in authority. Actually, there pretty much has to be a difference in authority. He's older. He, along the way, graduates high school. He drives. He's out working. So he's got more authority. In our culture, the male, when it comes to who's coercing or influencing whom,
Objection, Your Honor, to that.
I'll be,
Sustained.
Are there,
Last part is stricken.
are there cultural factors that go into willpower and being overboard?
yes, there are many scientific studies of the cultural relationships between men and women and the violence of men against women.
Objection to this, Your Honor, if I may be heard.
Go ahead.
And none of this was disclosed to the Commonwealth as far as any studies he'd be relying on, as far as any issues involving dominance of men or women.
And we covered this in the,
I do recall, Ms. Rayburn, and I can stand corrected by the record, that there was some discussion of the male-female interaction between Ms. Carter and Mr. Roy vis-a-vis this, who had influence over the other.
In the Commonwealth, I objected last time as well, so I believe I objected. We did have some conversation.
Was your objection sustained the last time?
Probably, Your Honor, but the counsel didn't, the witness didn't mention anything about any studies he'd be citing. Commonwealth is entitled to know what he's relying on. I know was informed of no such
It's not
studies.
true.
Therefore, I object again, for a different reason.
You want to try to establish a little more foundation, Mr. Cataldo?
surely. Doctor, in terms of cultural factors in men and women, are you familiar with any literature on this issue?
Yes.
And can you explain what literature you've reviewed?
Well, in my capacity of teaching a course for several semesters on the male abuse of women and children at the Conflict Resolution Center at George Mason, I familiarized myself with a vast literature, much of it published by feminist authors, starting way back with Betty Friedan, and then going up through a woman named Foreman and just a whole group of people, some of whom I'm in contact with and talk about these issues with. There's a vast literature on the problem of what's called patriarchy. And patriarchy involves the structuring of society more to the power advantage of women than to men. There is also a long evolutionary pattern that I've studied and written about. And I mentioned originally, Your Honor, that I have 2 chapters about this in my book, Guilt, Shame, and Anxiety. So this came up way back then. I talked about the 2 chapters in my book on guilt, shame, and anxiety.
And what were those, just to refresh our recollection, it was a couple hours ago, and what were those?
Well, this was even on the voir dire. And those
Oh,
2...
don't worry about the voir dire. You
Okay,
testified earlier today as to the 2 chapters. I have a record of that.
okay, I didn't remember that.
And is there anything else other than?
Well, yes, so I've taught the subject. I wrote a book chapter about it in one of my early books, Toxic Psychiatry, 1991, based on what I'd been learning from reading feminist literature and my own experience and my own clinical experience and knowing women and men about the problem of how men treat women in the psychiatric setting. I think it's better now. This was a long time, decades ago, somewhat better now. I've lectured on the subject. I lectured on an audience to Kate Millett, who was one of the great feminist women. And I lectured on these feminist issues, and she stood up afterwards and said, couldn't have done it better. I mean, I've worked in this area with people, real living people in the area of the issues surrounding men, the relationships between men and women.
And now I go back to my question, Dr. Breggin. Are there cultural factors that that you have analyzed with Conrad and Michelle that went into your thought process as to whether or not Will was overborne?
Objection, Your Honor.
Overruled.
Yes, there.
Okay. Review a letter that Conrad had left to Michelle.
Yeah.
And what was the significance of that to your clinical analysis?
The letter confirms that Conrad, while he's planning suicide, and this is a letter for that purpose, is...
What exhibit is this, please, for the record?
It's, I don't know the number.
It's a letter from October 2012?
Oh, no, it's a letter from July of 2014. And
All right, okay, we'll find it in that fashion.
There's no date on the letter. There's no date.
Oh, okay.
There's no date, all right.
There's something.
There's no date.
The journal.
I'll figure it out. Okay, thank you.
It confirms this pact. She doesn't see this letter, but it confirms that he's thinking the way that the text indicate. And so I'd like to kind of read just a little bit of it.
No, you don't need to read it.
Okay.
You need to tell us what the clinical significance of that letter is vis-à-vis your opinions you have testified to.
It shows that he is expecting to go to heaven, that he's expecting to have a relationship with her, that he loves her, that she's in no way been bullying him, that he's really happy with her. He says he loves her, and he thanks her for all the goodness and kindness that she's given him. It's not about being bullied. It's the opposite.
And Doctor, in your work, given your expertise in evaluating this case, was it important to you to look to other factors of why Conrad Roy killed himself?
Yes.
And what were those other factors that you examined?
Well, there are so many of them. First, what I wanted to look at was suicide risk. How much was he driven himself towards suicide as the cause of his own suicide? One of the most cited predictors of suicide is suicide attempts. And by the time he gets to Michelle, he's having, I think, his fourth, where he does water intoxication. Another is the severity of the suicide attempt. And his, at least one of his was, he nearly did himself, and he was found. Considered very severe,
Can you
intense.
voice up, doctor, for the record, please?
It was considered by him to be by everybody to be very severe. Another is background, and he comes from a background that at the time of his suicide was very contentious between the parents, as often happens during divorce with the best of folks, but it was very contentious. And he witnessed this. He witnessed arguing and fighting. And he attributes a lot of his depression to this. Dependency is another aspect of suicidality. Is the person growing up to take care of himself, have abilities to take care of himself? Is he able to handle himself in the world? He graduates high school. He goes to live with his father, and at one point with his mother, because his father's very difficult. He works for his father on his father's tugboat. He doesn't express that he likes what he's doing, where he's living, in the records, the medical records. He's negative about it. The relationship with his dad at times gets violent. And that's really a bad sign when the relationships get that bad between a father and son. And it's about April, I think, of 2014, the year he dies, that his father beats him up. The police come, they make criminal charges, and they send him to the hospital. They send Conrad to the hospital, to the emergency room, as I recall. So he's dealing with very, very difficult stuff. This is not a blame thing, because also imagine you're the parent of somebody who's as sick as Conrad. I mean, it's not easy, so I'm not trying to indict a parent. This is the situation that these people are in. And it's important that Conrad is involved in these kinds of activities where somebody gets that mad at him. In looking at his clinical record, I mentioned that he doesn't tell people a lot, and that's a bad sign. That he says the psychiatrist hates him. He stops going to the clinic he's in, and he's in what, from the medical record, looks like an unusually therapeutically oriented clinic. And he stops going, and they're charging him only $25 an hour. He's not motivated to get help, and Michelle is, of course, pushing him to get help and pushing him to get help before the dramatic change when she figures out what she thinks he needs. And he says he needs. He's just got one negative marker after another, in regard to suicide. And he himself says he's hopeless, says he's helpless, says he's going to kill himself. He goes to the extreme of terrifying her on, I believe, 2 occasions by not communicating with her after she's known he's suicidal. I think that indicates both the way he is a thought.
Objection, Your Honor.
Sustained as to what he thinks.
Okay.
That'll be stricken.
Those are a bunch of the issues, probably more. I mean, he's in a very bad state.
One moment, please.
Oh, and he's also talking with another person about
Objection.
health.
Wait for another question.
Okay.
Nothing further.
All right. This is an ideal time to take the lunch or recess. We will resume after. Thank you very much. You want to step down, Doctor?
Thank you.